Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is The Moon's Tears in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 26, Ad Vespra X. The light curtain of evening hung about them with sweet scents of lilting blossoms and the ever-present hum of Rungokai. Shinji brushed aside the still unfamiliar strands of short blonde hair, his eyes lazily cast about observing the streets sparsely traveled after the long day of festivities. It was one summer fair or another that Rose had sung about in that softy breathy voice he reserved for love songs. The musical blonde was currently to the left, ambling along beside Love and humming a jaunty tune under his breath, or at least Shinji assumed it was a jaunty tune. Sometimes one couldn't tell with the musician. While Love seemed to be contemplating something, if the furrowed brows and wandering eyes were any indication. Shunsui and Jushiro were talking in soothed whispers behind the rest of the group, ambling alone with fond light in their eyes. The sight of the two elder captains always brought a grin to Shinji's lips. He had known the two since his days in the academy. Granted, they had already graduated at the time, but they had been lieutenants to look up to. Seeing their happiness today always kindled a kind of nostalgic and soft warmth in his chest, accompanied by Sakonda's purr of agreement. Ishine was spouting some hypersensical nonsense, bouncing from one corner of the street to the other in his typical manner, eyes alight like a child. Kisuke was the lucky, read horribly unlucky, bastard that got to deal with Ishine. It was quite obvious already how much Kisuke was regretting it. A dull shade of displeasure cast his eyes sharply, and the brim of his hat, one Ichigo had tossed at the captain out of nowhere with a wide grin, was tilted to shade the other emotions of his visage. Jinrei had the fortune of being excused from this forced little frolic, as much as something regarding a collection of captains could be forced, because of his age or something of the sort. And well, the other captains had excuses or some other bull that excused them from the lovely evening stroll. In any case, Kensei was pacing alongside Shinji, mood sour in that he was missing a spar or joust that he had been vying to watch. They made a motley sort of crew, a collection of captains strolling down the streets of Rungokai. Sakonda purred her agreement, writhing strands of ebony wrapping around his wrists and tapping the steady rhythm of his heart against his pulse point. In an effort to, what was it Lisa had said? Shinji thought over it for a moment, trying to grasp his thoughts that tumbled about like dust on the plains. It had something to do with diplomatic relationships and reassuring bonds, of that Shinji had no doubt. The matter of it was that there was still a divide between the Vizard and the regular captains, so they had proposed a dinner, though that was more assumptions than fact. It was also to assure the morale of the common souls, as well as the cannon fodder Shinigami. Dully he heard Lisa chiding him for calling them that. Tensions were still running high, and it seemed everyone was waiting for an inevitable fallout with heavy hearts. So, they were here to prove that the Shinigami who had been hollowified could cohabitate with the normal residents. A chill wind blew through the narrow alleyway, carrying with it soft shivers of ominousness that straightened his spine like ice and had his senses on high alert, scanning their surroundings. A wooden sign clacked harshly against a baseboard, and their small band of merry men ground to a sparse halt, eyes keen for shadows in the darkness. Crime rates had been low in Seoul society recently, thanks to Kisuke and Ichigo's plotting, so Shinji doubted it was any idiot with the gal to try and attack them. It left the question of the muted presences and the chill of the breeze for a summer wind. With one breath and the next the presence was gone, and the enshrouding heat of summer was around them once more, enlivening the chilled sweat of their bodies and cloying the air with heavy bursts of roasting meats and fragrant steaks. The group resumed their gentle, unhurried pace in quiet, until loud raucous laughter picked up behind them and Shunsui's deep throaty laughter bounced around them. It was enough to disperse the tense atmosphere and kindle smiles on the other captains' faces. Kisuke hurried to walk beside Shinji, casting paranoid eyes over his shoulder as Ishine amused himself with one of the women at the street corner. While Shinji didn't necessarily doubt the man's sense of direction, he worried slightly about the man-child getting lost. A warm hand clasped his shoulder, and Shinji glanced into Kisuke's simmering gunmetal gray eyes. Underneath the tame facade of the calm, egotistical scientist, unease lingered, and Shinji erringly recalled that Kisuke was never one for social interactions in the first place. Shinji flashed the scientist a reassuring smile, sending out fragile stings of Reisu to comfort the other blonde. Kisuke smiled gratefully in return before he drifted into the crowd once more, likely trying to uphold his promise to the Shihoan princess to try and keep Shiba Ishine out of trouble, however futile an endeavor. The haunting caress of a string instrument's voice resounded around them, and Shinji brushed a hand through short locks in slight exasperation, Knowing Rose had likely picked up an instrument from Kami knows where, the man had the disturbing ability to find an instrument anywhere he went. The man had even found one in the forest of the 78th district of all things. The glowing sphere of the restaurant loomed out above them, the hustle and bustle full of good cheer that always accompanied a place such as that drifted out in a welcoming wave. Shinji felt himself relax slightly knowing the night was nowhere near done but that they had at least arrived without incident, if one didn't count the near run-in with a furious woman and her shoe. A vague shape appeared in the distance doing a rather impressive job of appearing drunk, with the way the figure tilted and stilted its way towards them. Caution bred itself in Shinji's lungs accompanied by apprehension and he cursed his earlier thoughts of an incidentless walk. The figure swayed in front of the restaurant for a subtle moment before stepping forward to rest against the daub earthy-toned walls of the split eel. As they drew near and the muffled presence of the figure became clearer, Shinji let out a slightly relieved sigh, before another sigh followed, this one an amalgamation of emotions that always swelled inside his chest when it came to a certain Shinigami. Some were negative like the worry that swelled with the kid, and the others were positive like the relief of being reunited with kin. Ichigo tilted his head from under the crown of his bangs, eyes sweeping the area. He flinched slightly as if seeing a shade of the night before his gaze landed on their merry crew and a fond smile settled on his lips. As they drew under the covenant of the lamplight, Shinji could see Ichigo's figure clearer, and damn did the kid look bad. Ichigo had always carried a weariness with him, it clung to him like a second skin. Heck, even when he first met the kid in that dingy old pub he had been tired, it had been stark on his features then and it was all the more so now. Those first few days of training Shinji had been perpetually worried about their youngest, but Ichigo showed no signs of his insomnia other than the midnight wanderings and the purple hills beneath his eyes. For the first week or so it had gotten worse each night, and Shinji had wondered how far it would go before the kid collapsed, till the point Ichigo had been swaying on his feet when they weren't looking. Then Aizen had pulled the kid aside one night, talked to him by the light of a dying fire. Ichigo's sleep had improved after that in a gradual manner that took some of the worry lining Shinji's brow away. But then Shinji hadn't seen Ichigo for a few days, it had only been a week, and he looked like death decided to skinny dip up north. Everything about Ichigo seemed pale as if the life was literally drained from him, his skin was paper white, when damn it the kid should have a tan. He had seen him after one of their beach excursions and the kid had glowed. His hair hung around him, and damn it the kid's hands were trembling. Then there were his eyes. It was always the eyes that gave it away and drew Shinji in like a whirlpool. They weren't dead, which was some reassurance, but it was like that day where Ichigo hadn't slept properly for 5-something days. They were utterly raw, as if Ichigo couldn't muster the strength to cover up the pain and sorrow that always dwelled in the kid, and it was mildly horrifying that this was after Ichigo had healed some. This wasn't even the worst it could be. Not to mention the weariness that went hand in hand with the torrential downpour of emotions. Kami Shinji wanted to drag the dem kid to Anohana's so she could put him in a sleeping coma, or alternatively so he could get some rest and face Anohana's wrath. Maybe then it would aid the kid in getting some actual sleep. Shinji wondered if he had ever seen the kid not look tired. It had always been there, however minute in their last few days. It was as if the kid was running himself into an early grave and wasn't even aware of it, which was totally likely considering how obtuse Ichigo could sometimes be. It was hard to say he hadn't known the kid that long, and what a pity because the youth was quite interesting. He would have to talk to Kaien or Ichigo's friend the cook Akier. Eving Ichi. Shinji called out in lieu of greeting. Ichigo cocked his head for a moment as if the sound came distorted through water before another smile stoked his face and he half-heartedly waved at the group. Shinji's eyes hastily cast back to the rear of the group, catching Shunsui's burning cocoa orbs. He directed his gaze between Ichigo and the elder captain. The man stared for a quiet moment, much as Shinji had been doing, as his hind finally bounded up behind them. "So Ichigo, what are you doing here?" Jushiro asked, polite curiosity in his voice even as it was belied by the concern the man felt for the young lieutenant. That same concern was heavy in the hearts of the assembled Shinigami, because somehow the kid had half-off Soul Society wrapped around his finger without even realizing it. Ichigo shrugged, running his hand through his hair, taking a moment to think about it before he replied with a shrug, "I don't much know myself, guess I needed a bit of fresh air." Shinji idly thought of the time as he stared at the shimmering disk sinking low on the horizon. He wondered if Ichigo had been attempting to sleep and was disturbed by nightmares, and didn't he remember some of those nights in the caves? Shunsui caught Shinji's eyes and shared a solemn nod, obviously seeing what Shinji saw and likely more, having known the lieutenant for many years now. Ishine burst through the gathering of Shinigami at that moment, boundless Shiba enthusiasm eluding his every step as he seemed to skip towards Ichigo, and before anyone could have thought to stop the batshit crazy captain, he slid an arm around the young male. Ichigo tensed fiercely as if resisting the urge to brutally stab the older Shiba, before Ishine's Reisu was wrapping around the kid like a horde of blankets. Ichigo abruptly settled, all the tenseness deflating from his form till he appeared much smaller in Ishine's large form. One hand was shakily fisted into Ishine's shiakusho as if Ichigo was trying to ground himself. It struck Shinji deep inside to see their kid like this, see Ichigo hurting and being unable to do anything for him. Sakanda growled, her agreement, waves of protective instincts drumming against Shinji's careful barriers of control. Rose rested a hand on Shinji's shoulder, a strange parallel of their earlier walk. Shinji looked up into Rose's now gold eyes and could see the mirroring emotions that were haunting Shinji. Their Reisu tangled for a few minutes, settling the other's hollows slightly and placating the desperate need to help their own. Turning his attention to Ichigo once more, Shinji could see the kid was starting to get antsy again. It was rare to see Ichigo take comfort from someone in public, even more so to see him display what he would term weakness. Ichigo really must be out of it, Shinji thought with a sigh as he ran a hand through short blonde strands. Ichigo's eyes were darting around as if he was trying to plot an escape, and with a slightly rueful but mostly gleeful smile Shinji interjected, "Well, now that the gang's all assembled, Ichi, how about you join us for dinner?" There was the familiar vengeful glare that had normal souls quaking in their boots, or shoes, or whatever. Then again, no high-ranking Shinigami was normal, so Shinji brushed the glare off with a laugh while sending a slightly apologetic cast of his head towards Ichigo. The orange-haired teen frowned, knowing he wouldn't escape, before he shrugged and sighed, restless Reisu scraping across his skin. It was wild tonight, but thick with the undertones of the older of Ichigo's two spirits' presence, Zanjitsu Asen if Shinji recalled correctly. The one who was calm and collected like a deep spring of maturity, and the one who balanced Ichigo's more instinctive side. Ishine finally released Ichigo on account of willful tugging on Kisuke's part as he dragged the, slightly, younger male into the restaurant to actually get their table. Kensei smirked softly, the one he reserved for Mashiro on a particularly whimsical day, and ruffled Ichigo's locks. The kid hissed like an upset cat and batted his hand at Kensei, but remained otherwise immobile as if still debating the merit of escaping. Then Shunsui and Jushiro ambled up on either side of Ichigo, loosely boxing the younger Shinigami in. Ichigo sighed in defeat, flashing his captain a knowing smile before the rest of them conglomerated at the doorway. Ishine cheerfully waved from the back, while Kisuke was doing an excellent impression of a sulking teenager, likely annoyed that he had been stuck with man-child duty. Ichigo spared one last glance at the outside world before following them and coming to stroll beside Shinji. The blonde captain idly fingered Sakanda's hilt and sent out soft waves of Reisu to meet Ichigo's own volatile force. At Shinji's touch, the concussive force, like a defensive pet striking out protectively for its master, simmered to a faint pulse of animosity before being submerged by the warmth of Ichigo's soul. Taking in a deep breath rich with the spices of the restaurant, Shinji let his eyes cast around the place Shunsui had recommended, and Rangiku, Ishine's lieutenant with a lovely personality, had seconded. The place, like most of the restaurants in Rungokai, was a mess of tables and cushions, accompanied by simple rice-patterned walls. From the ceiling, oil lamps encased in amber-colored glass hung, and the smoky, soothing scent of incense was in the air. A few people were chattering aimlessly, but otherwise the restaurant was near empty. This festival seemed to promote early sleep or something of the sort, and it was quite late for dinner, Shinji thought with a half-smile, eyes dully watching as the waitresses scurried about the place. "Nay, Shinji?" Ichigo questioned softly as they followed the boisterous shouting that could only ever be Ishine Shiba. Shinji cocked a head while Rose sent a curious glance at them over his shoulder. Jushiro and Shunsui, who were still behind the rest of the group, looked up at Ichigo's question, doubtlessly wondering like the rest of them what Ichigo had to ask. "Why are you all here?" Ichigo questioned with a curious tilt to his head. Damn kids should not get to be that cute, and a sway of untamable orange locks much like their owner. Ichigo's question promoted laughter at the honest confusion in Ichigo's voice. "We're meeting up for diplomatic reasons," as the Suteiko spelled it out. Shunsui interjected with that puppy dog smile of his, accompanied by familiar goofiness. Shunsui had gotten it mostly right in the end, even if Ichigo was looking a little confused, Before Shinji or even Shu could interject, Love ruffled the kid's hair and said, "Don't worry, we can explain it better when we sit down." Here he paused, casting his gaze to the other Shinigami who had managed to loiter around the entrance for a good long while, if the head hostess' irritation was any indication. Then Love continued, "But first we need to sit down." Ichigo chuckled quietly, a faint blush appearing stark on his cheeks. Jushiro, taking pity on the near unmovable cluster of Shinigami clogging up the front, began to horde them towards the one table at the back, still accompanied by two Shinigami and large enough to fit their impressive numbers. One Shinigami who would be fairly annoyed, and the other would be, well, is Hein. Once everyone was seated, with Shinji to Ichigo's right, "Take that, Rose," and Kisuke on Shinji's right, the waitress came out to take drink orders. Ichigo stared at the menu as if he was contemplating burning a hole in it, that or if he really wanted to drink alcohol. Shinji had met a drunk Ichigo, though where they even had the quantities needed to get the kid drunk he wondered, and boy was it an experience. The kid was like a swing when it came to emotions, flipping between happiness and sorrow in a split second. The kid had also been amorous and far too willing to account various adventurous acts he had prepared. Yet the kid never shared a word about his past, seeming to have locked them up somewhere so far in his mind that only he could reach it. Ichigo in the end had decided against Sake, which, well, likely the wiser decision, left Shinji pouting at the lack of entertainment that could have been gained from that venture. Light chatter started around the table as the comfortable atmosphere seeped into their bones. Shunsui had his head on his shoulders that morning in suggesting the place. It was quiet and relatively secluded, with a few customers and incredibly delicious food. Plus, the overall presence of the place was refreshing, not filled with the thick blanket of Reisu that smothered the whole of Seoul society. Ichigo looked better as well. There was a freeness there that the warmth of family always released in him. Chatter picked up along the table, amiable subjects such as the rather dramatic amounts of paperwork, or a lieutenant's newest crazy scheme. All the while the waitresses bustled back and forth, ferrying their drinks with an even grace and fluidity. Shinji settled back against the wall and watched everyone interact, happy to see his family, being both Vizard and Shinigami, interact so well. Rose and Love were chatting with this Hein about one daring mission or the other, accompanied by the rhythmic hum of Rose's guitar. Shunsui and Jushiro were in their own little world, but they deigned to chat with Kensei and Kisuke, though Jushiro was the one leading the conversation of the four antisocial men. Ichigo had a content look on his face, though his eyes were still shadowed under drapes of hanging orange. His Reisu had settled. "So Ichi, how are ya settlin' in?" Shinji questioned, wanting to include the youth, and knowing that if Ichigo had his way he wouldn't have to speak for the whole night. Sadly, for the kid, Shinji was a well-known crusher of dreams, or at least that was what Aizen mockingly snipped. Ichigo startled as if lost in thought, blinking owlishly at Shinji for a moment before he took the chance to think over Shinji's question. "I think things have been well, though there was that incident with the jerk and Lisa on our first day." Ichigo started quietly before finishing with a faint exclamation and swift shake of his head. Shinji recalled hearing about the incident and how of course it had happened to Ichigo's division. It had occurred strange for a few minutes that an incident could arise so quickly, before he had resolutely acknowledged that this was Ichigo and things like that were bound to happen. Love cocked a head diagonal from Shinji, and Rose, noticing his partner's interest, flicked his eyes over to the two. Ichigo shrunk back slightly in his seat, unused to the excess attention, and Shinji rattled his head in slight exasperation. That may be the reason for the dinner." Love mused under breath, garnering the attention of the whole table with a simple turn of phrase, because really, they were all half wondering why they were here. Rose, although always one for dramatics, ran a hand through curly blonde locks in a familiar sign of exasperation at his partner's tact or lack thereof. Ichigo tilted his head in curiosity, amber orbs a touch wide with confusion. Shinji wanted to laugh at how youthful the expression made Ichigo seem, but refrained on the basis of receiving a firm punch to the solar plex from Ichigo if he dared. Love, noticing Ichigo's confusion, made to amend his statement, and in that chill rumble said, "Well, it's just how things are right now." When that statement incurred a lack of understanding from Ichigo, the captain slumped, afro shaking with his movements. Rose hid his amusement behind a dainty gesture, eyes bubbling with amusement, and in a half-joking, half-serious manner he patted Love on the shoulder. A series of glances passed along the table as the gathered adults debated who would be the one to try and explain the fiasco of a situation to Ichigo. It was funny that of all things the kid didn't understand it was politics. Ichigo had a good head on his shoulders, hell, he managed to keep up with the scientists on their mad behest and spurn of words. But it seemed that Ichigo just didn't have the mind for the tricky stuff. Heck, Shinji hadn't for the longest time, but dealing with the Central 46 bastards smacked some of the sense into one's head. Then again, Ichigo seemed to be one more for handling the situation bluntly with as little plotting as possible, for example how they dealt with the aforementioned bastards. Ichigo didn't have the heart nor the patience, but few had the very great patience required to deal with the bastards. Most of them got by through sheer force of will, to sit for hours and debate, so he had silenced them and made demands. It was a bit clearer now what Ichigo had instigated when he spoke of what might have happened when they returned to Soul Society. The kid could acknowledge well enough what would likely happen, but the tricky behind-the-scenes stuff wasn't Ichigo's fling. He knew the hearts of the people, not the minds of the madmen. It seemed a consensus had been reached, and Shinji sighed, knowing that he would be one of the ones to attempt to explain politics to the clueless orange head, along with Jushiro, who would veritably do a better job. "Are ya really sure ya want me to try? Have ya seen me at the academy?" Shinji pointed out with a low drawl, in a last bid to escape his fate, but also generally telling the truth. While it was amusing to see the confusion on the kids' faces, what wasn't so amusing was trying to go through an explanation in 6 different ways. You know, Shinji isn't half wrong. I've had to sit through a few of his lectures myself, no offense. Shunsui spoke up with a teasing baritone and an easy smile. He flashed one of his knowing grins at Shinji before turning his attention to Jushiro's prodding. There was another round of glances exchanged, and while they debated, he knew he would still be chosen in the end. Shinji glanced over towards Ichigo. The kid was staring at the far wall, a bit zoned out after having waited so long for an answer. His hazy amber orbs were focused on nothing, and the hand not grasping Zanjutsu's pommel was shaking again. Damn, the kid was in a funk tonight, Shinji thought sadly as he leant over and gently jostled his shoulder against the youth. Ichigo startled but remained quiet, eyes widening in surprise before they swung around to land on Shinji. Questions lingered in Shinji's own eyes, asking Ichigo if he was okay, and if the kid would please talk to someone because it hurt them all to see him in such a bad state. Guilt flushed Ichigo's cheeks, and he tipped his head forward so that flaming orange could shade his eyes from sight. It was true they were all worried about him, and some part of Ichigo would feel guilty about that, but the kid also wasn't willing to talk. A light cough and push of Reisu pulled him from his musings, and he turned his attention to the rest of the group, having already made peace with his fate. Reassuringly, he wrapped his Reisu around Ichigo, letting his presence comfort the kid and pull him out of his own guilt as much as he could. "Well, yeah, see, Ichi, the thing is, right now whatever we do has consequences. So that battle where Lisa totally and rightfully kicked that guy's ass raised the tensions in Soul Society." Shinji started catching the kid off balance and brining his attention to the rest of the group. Ichigo half nodded once, simmering amber orbs blazing up with that familiar faint spark of determination as Ichigo resolved to try and understand what they were speaking of. "The thing is, Ichigo, right now everyone is worried because one wrong move could lead to the 2 forces of Soul Society clashing. That would be bad for both sides as well as the citizens. As such, everyone is watching our movements. It's why we had this dinner, to assure the public that we are all getting along well." Jushiro took over, speaking in that soothing lull of his that managed to comfort any Shinigami willing to listen. Ichigo looked up, catching Jushiro's warm cocoa orbs, and he smiled softly, encouraging the older captain to continue. "That's why the fight from earlier in the week had negative connotations. It portrayed the worst outcome of our situation. But as it didn't amount to anything but a demotion of the Shinigami, it didn't correlate to too much damage." Jushiro finished with a smile as the waitresses returned laden with a multitude of steaming plates. The heavenly scent that wafted through the air was like the gardens of lore-spoken paradise. Conversation stilted to a halt as the gathered captains and lieutenant began their meal, digging into the vast and rich resources of simple cuisine. Shinji looked up at a slight shuffle beside him to see Ichigo, a contemplative gaze perched below his brow. In a rather mechanical motion he was slowly eating, eyes elsewhere, seeing something on another plane. "Nay, Shinji?" Ichigo questioned softly, likely feeling the blonde's inquisitive stare. Shinji nodded his head, signaling he had heard the youth, a wide and easy smile splitting his lips. Ichigo paused for a moment more, as if collecting his thoughts before he continued. "So it would be bad for a fight to occur even between the wizard." And the attention of the table was focused on them once more. Shinji wondered if either of the two of them were part magnet, with the way the other's gazes always seemed drawn to the orange-haired Shinigami and Shinji. Yep, probably cause load of concern and paranoia. People thinking we're crazy savage beasts that are going to snap, that and the Reisu alone would be enough to send people into fits if they're not exposed to as slowly. Love interjected easily, speaking in that voice that soothed the nerves like honey. He had flipped the lens of his shades up so he could glance at Ichigo as if to get the message across. Ichigo pouted and muttered under his breath, "Hey, I'm not Hiri." Shinji chuckled under his breath at the kid's mutterings because it was true, and they had been lucky that the violent blonde hadn't already departed on a reign of terror throughout Seoul society. Laughter drifted through the air at the kid's petulant expression, and Ichigo brightened faintly, Reisu stirring to coil around Shinji in a vaguely fond way. "It would probably even be bad if one of us got sick," Kensei stated, lacking any sense of the situation or how to read it, but that was normal for the sometimes block-headed captain, or at least that was what Mashiro insisted, so the information was questionable at best. Ichigo frowned right along with Shinji at the statement. Turning to his side, he wanted to ruffle the kid's hair so that the demure panic would fade. Kami, it was always an emotional roller coaster when the Godi I-13's strongest gathered, too many crazy personalities under one roof. Why would it be a problem? Ishine asked, unusually serious eyes darting between Kensei and Ichigo before firmly resting on his nephew. Kensei frowned, gaze sharp as he assessed the Shiba he made to answer when Rose interrupted, fluently sliding into the opening in the conversation. "Well, the more simple-minded might think we had fallen ill because of our hollow sides, or that we possessed some strange contagion. In any case, I say it will blow over in." Rose spoke eloquently before pausing thoughtfully and casting a meaningful glance at Shinji. The short-haired blonde frowned in thoughts for a second, contemplatively stroking his chin before he spoke loud enough for the table to hear. 2 weeks. Rose nodded with that musician's smile before he continued, "It will settle down eventually, in a gradual manner, so all we need to do is refrain from getting sick or engaging in fighting, which will be the harder of the two." Possessing his ever-present flair for dramatics, Rose finished by tilting his sake cup against Love's. The afro-haired man grinned before clinking his own with Shunsui's. The macabre atmosphere that had drifted over their heads dispersed, and Kisuk called out in that saccharine sarcastic tone, the one that somehow sounded both serious and coy. "And no visits from the science division." There were some who chuckled easily at Kisuk's joke, while there were a few uneasy laughs hidden beneath the mirth of the others. Shinji sensed what the captain was implying underneath his jovial tones. He took with the penchant for dramatics he possessed. There was a sharp warning that while Kisuk would try to keep his division in line, some, namely Mayuri, might try anything. Sensing a slight shift in Ichigo's Reisu that was hardly perceptible, Shinji glanced over to see the kid. Ichigo had closed himself off as if a dam trying to hold back the might of the world's waters. Instead, that force came rushing through his eyes. Kami, damn it, they had scared the kid a little and likely traumatized him. Okay, Shinji was being a bit overdramatic in those respects. He doubted the kid hadn't heard worse. But it was clear Ichigo was worrying, some internal debate flashing through his mind's eyes and translating itself to the snaking wasps of Reisu that fluttered lightly against the orange-haired Shinigami's skin. "Hey, Ichi, don't worry, everything will be fine." Ichigo looked up at Shunsui's hushed words. The chocolate-haired captain wrapped his Reisu around the kid and flashed him one of those sincere bubbly smiles that always brought one to Shinji's face. Ichigo nodded faintly, though Shinji wondered how much the youth believed of their words. Ichigo's eyes glimmered a bit brighter all the same, and underneath there was a wicked flash of pain. Shinji felt short-lived relief that his favorite orange head, because where could you find another orange head, was okay, because he doubted what he had seen was a trick of the iridescent oil lamps, but he decided not to push a likely snappy Ichigo. "Though what we really need to worry about is your nightlife," Ishine interjected happily, all bouncy wide grin. Ichigo tensed at that, swaying between annoyance and worry at the older Shiba's words. Ishine's declaration caught the attention of the others, and ever a man for attention under the eyes of the others, he continued, "Your love life, my nephew." Ichigo turned red as the early morning flowers growing in the fields south of the once great battlefields. The scarlet painted his cheeks sharply, highlighting the paleness of his skin once more. Shinji couldn't help but burst out laughing at the helpless expression dancing across Ichigo's features, soon accompanied by the light laughter of the other occupants of the table. In one moment, the expression was gone and Ichigo's brow was twitching, the youth leaning ever closer to stabbing a still bellowing Ishine. Jushiro reached over and ruffled Ichigo's hair, disturbing the rather fearsome image he had been projecting and leaving the wild mane of hair to spike all the more so. Ichigo settled back in his seat with a pout, doing a fine impression of Kisuk earlier in the evening, all the while maintaining a fierce glower directed towards Ishine. Rose slid a sake cup over to Ichigo with a melodious hum and a mellow smile. Ichigo considered the glass, eyes flickering between it and the blonde before he nodded, the angry persona disappearing in a flash as Ichigo tipped the drink back, smiling through the dull burn of sake afterwards, letting the faint play of anger fade away. The light atmosphere resumed once more, and this time Love and Rose's combined efforts dragged the kid into the fray. Rose's silvery voice lifted above the swaying white noise as if carried towards heaven's limbs as he regaled the table with his adventure in the human world, where he had met a most remarkable woman. You see, at first I thought her for a man, but it was not so. She was a lady. One who had led the troops through the higher peaked columns of our neighbor's frontier. Rose lilted pleasantly, beside the curly blonde. Love chuckled, flicking his fingers at Rose's temple before he added, then the idiot decided it would be a good idea to fall firmly on his face in the snow. Rose pouted indulgently as laughter rippled along the table, even pulling that light airy fey laughter from Ichigo. The darkness that had swollen like the early tides had receded, but the tiredness of hearth-glowing ember still remained. Shunsui jumped into the opening in the conversation, attempting to begin a tale of his daring bravado while facing a wicked feminine serpent, before he was promptly quieted by Jushiro as he lightly hit his partner on the head. Shunsui began whining, pawing at Jushiro's arm, and Shinji joined the others in their mirth at their now familiar actions. A flash of movement out of the corner of his peripheral vision caught Shinji's attention. Ishine was standing up, contemplating the table as if decided whether he would blow off into night's firefly-light embrace. Feeling Shinji's attention, the head of the Shiba clan lifted a hand with a wide grin, shaking his asterisk Kizaru, catching the light of the oil lamps with the gold embellishing detailing the sides in swirled patterns of noble design. The man made an acute gesture with his unoccupied hand, gesturing for Shinji to come along. The short-haired blonde swept his eyes around the table for a moment, deciding whether he would venture out with the enigmatic captain. Another bottle of sake was resting innocently on the table, likely already near empty. Looking at his fellow captains, for some he could already see the rosy pink of inebriation. Turning to Ichigo, he saw the kid watching with a amused smirk that held a slice of mischief. Knowing the kid could handle himself, and would likely have blackmail for years to come, Shinji heaved himself from his seat, taking a moment after being disoriented, having remained seated for so long. Ichigo turned concerned viper fast to gaze at Shinji, questions bubbling up like a curious child. Shinji flashed the kid a reassuring smirk before he turned and trailed after Ishine, the broader man having already cleared a path through the restaurant. The air outside was crisp and clear with the onset of night, tangy with the fragrant blossoms littering eaves above, and the mellow sting of sake. Ishine leaned against the wall of the split eel, the Kizaru perched against his lips, wispy strands of silver glowing like mystical moonlight drifting into the open air. Ishine quirked an eyebrow, gesturing lightly with the Kizaru Shiba, blazing brown eyes glowing in the eve of the restaurant light. Shinji shrugged, taking the proffered pipe and inhaling the heavy taste of tobacco, feeling the way the smoke listed through his lungs before he released the pipe and blew out, the smoke curling against the roof of his mouth. Passing the pipe to Ishine, Shinji let his gaze focus on the crescent moon hanging in the sky, clustered about by tiny pinpricks of light. Kisuke always lectured Shinji on how they were so very far away no matter how close they appeared, and that they were beyond even the earth. "I'm worried about him," Ishine confessed, taking a deep drag from the Kizaru, his own gaze a touch melancholic, staring at the same sky as Shinji. The blonde captain considered the man's statement heavily before he replied, "Everyone is. It's clear he ain't sleepin' well, and he damn well won't see Anohana on his own." Ishine sighed and nodded at Shinji's low drawl. The blonde captain knew his words held truth. It was clear in the restaurant. The assessing gazes the captains had periodically cast towards Ichigo, accompanied by worry and concern with what they saw. He also knew that one of them would have to corner Ichigo into seeing Anohana before it got any worse, because Shinji had no doubt that the situation could get worse. Yeah, it's strange. He was fine the first day and then he just deteriorated, yeah no? I think he tries to get to sleep, but Kyan's told me he keeps seeing Ichi on the roof in the early hours of the morning. I want to talk to him, but I've never been good at connecting with Ichi. Hell, few people can actually get past those walls of his. Ishine spoke tiredly, as if carrying the weight of his nephew's burden had weighed his own shoulders. The new information didn't shock Shinji. Somehow it seemed obvious that Ichigo was someone to sit on rooftops in the hours when the sun hadn't woken, but it left a deep-seated heaviness in his gut that had Sakanda rolling along with him. "Guess Kyan's our best option then?" Shinji questioned, the image of the sea stone strong lieutenant coming to mind. The man normally possessed a calm temperament when it came to his duties as a Shinigami, though he was occasionally bubbly like a puppy with a sword. Then you invoked Ichigo and he flipped between overexcited puppy and mother bird of doom. It was both humorous and always left Shinji worrying for his health. Kaion and Ichigo were close, brothers in a bond that required more than just blood. They had shared sake and stories countless times. He was one of the few people who could really touch Ichigo's soul and convince the kid of their point. Kaion connected with Ichigo in things they couldn't hope to understand. Ishine nodded, stroking his chin and resting the pipe between his lips. His eyes were distant and soft in the way they always went when he thought of his family. With a breath of smoke like the coiling warning of a dragon, he replied, "Yeah, he is. I'll talk to him, see if he can knock some sense into Ichi." Shinji laughed softly at the joking tones, the tense and somber atmosphere abetted slightly by the jovialness that laughter always ensconced. From behind them the sounds of mirthful hysterics rose, like a group of caterwauling cats. The two shared a look, one of knowing amusement, before Ishine tucked the pipe into one of his sleeves and slid open the thin shoji doors with a grandiose flourish. A gust of warmth wrapped their forms from within, tugging insistently on the cloth of their shiakusho and enticing away the cool chill of the night. Shinji slid into the seat beside Ichigo with a huff, the heady taste of tobacco still heavy on his tongue and dancing with his senses. A whisper of a flush painted Ichigo's cheeks, accompanied by that wide grin that he flashed when he was unusually joyful. "Back so soon?" Ichigo questioned, easily crooking one brow and letting youthful amber slit mischievously. Shinji chuckled and ruffled the brat's tangled mane of orange, ignoring the low swipes at his hand. Stealing Ichigo's sake cup, Shinji downed the burning liquid before he replied with a Cheshire grin, "Just checking that our retreat strategy is still in place. Looks like we won't be here too much longer. A drunk Kensei is, to say the least, an interesting night." Ichigo smiled a bit brighter. Like any antisocial person, his socializing bar, as Kaion had dutifully dubbed it with a flourish, was likely full. Under Shinji's nose Ichigo retrieved, "Stole dem sneaky kid, spending too much time near Yoryuki," the sake cup and poured himself another glass of the warm liquid. They sat together in the cheery warmth of the restaurant, listening to the other captains prevail with interesting stories. Some gripped Shinji's attention like a vice and he felt like he couldn't turn away, others had him straining to cage a yawn. Looking to his left, he could see Ichigo's eyelids drooping and his head was resting in his palm. The kid looked moments away from crashing. "How about Ichi share something and then we send the kitty off to bed?" Shinji asked as he poked the kid. Ichigo sighed a long-suffering sigh before he raised his head from his hand, catching the amused looks of the members of the table. Ichigo thought for a few moments, brows furrowing and orange shading pensive amber, before the kid visibly perked with a story to share. "My friend once was kidnapped." He received rather confused and horrified looks at the blunt statement before he continued, "and she was taken by her brother who ran a gang. So, my friends and I, a rowdy group of adolescents, decided to rescue her." Ichigo continued to talk of the incident with nostalgic smile, eliciting laughter from the group as he told of a man who couldn't stop dancing, and another dressed like a peacock. How sand appeared from nowhere, and how a certain redhead was trying way too damn much to save her. "Well, I had to throw her," Ichigo began, hesitantly reaching the conclusion of his story. From what the kid had been saying, they had been on top of a building at the time. Everyone was shooting slightly dumbstruck or awe-shaken looks at Ichigo, who rubbed the back of his neck in a vaguely embarrassed manner. "Let me get this straight, Ichigo, you tossed your friend from the top of a building?" Kisuke questioned, slightly disbelieving. Ichigo nodded with a smile that lightly ventured into the realms of sadistic before he continued, "Yep, she went sailing into the arms of the redhead. Then they both yelled at me as if I had sent her to her doom." Ichigo ended on a slightly questioning note, blasé confusion soft underneath the nostalgia. Laughter trickled along the table and Shinji could hear murmurs of, "Only you, Ichigo," and, "Of course the kid did something like that." Ichigo rubbed at his eyes as if trying to brush away the sleep like an infant, and Shinji knew it was time to send the kid off to Morpheus realm. Grasping Ichigo's forearm, he heaved the kid to his feet and pulled the young Shinigami out of the clustered mess of chairs and chair legs. "I'll see Ichigo off, fellas." There was some pouting that Ichigo was leavening, but it was disenchanted by the small wave Ichigo gave them all and his good night said in that deep, caring voice accompanied by a shallow bow, "Thank you all for allowing me to dine with you tonight. May your night be restful." Amusement broke out among the table at Ichigo's formal goodbye, along with a chorus of farewells in return as Shinji steered Ichigo towards the exit. Pushing aside the thin doors, Ichigo shot a final wave over his shoulder before he stepped outside into the cool night, Shinji following close behind him. "Do you want me to walk ya home?" Shinji questioned honestly with good intent. Ichigo frowned before he paused and considered the offer. In the end, he shook his head in the negative with a light smile on his lips. Shinji stepped forward, drawing the kid into a tight hug. He let his Reisu wrap around the soul in his arms. "You take care of yourself, Ichi. Get some sleep, or by the 7th layer of heaven I will drag you to Anohana," Shinji whispered, ending on a light joking note. Ichigo laughed muffled against Shinji's shoulder before he pulled back so that Shinji could see radiant amber orbs. Ruffling the kid's locks in farewell, Shinji disengaged from Ichigo, watching amused as the kid patted his hair down and straightened his clothing. "Night, Shinji, I will. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine," Ichigo assured with a faint curve of his lips. Shinji nodded reluctantly, watching as the thin figure turned with a final wave and became a faint shadow retreating into the mists of night's embrace. Somehow Shinji doubted Ichigo's words. He only hoped his instincts were wrong. Sakanda purred her agreement in the recesses of his mind. Turning once more to face the restaurant, Shinji shrugged aside the worry of the night and prepared to return to their little haven of mirth. X. Chapter 27, Tosca. X. Go to sleep. No. Go to sleep. I told you no. Go to sleep. Fine, I'm trying. Are you asleep? No. Go to sleep. I can't when you keep yelling at me to. It worked last time. Last time your definition of sleep was slamming my head into a building till I passed out. Ichigo grumbled at Shiro. The spirit's dual-tone voice echoed throughout his mindscape. Their bond thrummed with the pale spirit's ambient Reisu. It curled around Ichigo like a cat. Low vibrations resembling a purr thrummed along Ichigo's veins in a lulling trance that drew Ichigo away from reality and into the soft crescents of Reisu fluttering along his soul. Shiro muttered something indecipherable in the back of Ichigo's mind, the spirit's concern radiating from the core of their inner world. Zanjitsu Asen's presence also fluttered with concern and worry for their wielder in that well-deepening way. Ichigo pushed aside the faint voices of his subconscious as he willed his eyes open from their heavy slumber. Feeling like he was fighting a great battle that was already quite lost, he was seated in the office of the 8th Division still, though it felt like he had left before. It was like waking to a strange dream, a keen sense of déjà vu lingering about his senses just as much as the cloudy drowsiness. It was like that when only Zanjitsu Asen's deep baritone and Shiro's Reisu were able to cajole him out of bed, the heaviness that pressed him into the mattress disturbed only by his sense of duty and his two soul kin. Ichigo needed to just waste the days away where he didn't have to feel the dead, and he could be left to the thoughts of his mind however much they tortured him. But that could cause problems if he wasn't seen for weeks, and if Ichigo had an abundance of any substance, it was problems. The quiet hum of paperwork being filled out lilted about the office, accompanied by the minute shuffle of papers and the rustle of fabric. Blinking away the disorientation and grogginess, Ichigo yawned and reached up to shield his eyes from the lights dancing like a kaleidoscope in front of him, a whirlwind of circles and bright flashing motions that floated across his sight. Adjusting to the light slowly, Ichigo considered the office. Faint sunlight cast grasping shadows upon the furniture and illuminated the curved wooden spirals. Ichigo looked around himself, taking in the desk where he was seated, and Shunsui's form hunched over the other desk, dutifully filling out paperwork for a change. Ichigo stared, his mind feeling like it was coated in a thick amber, and that everything was moving at a speed beyond slow. There was a quiet contemplation weighing Ichigo's brow. The world around him suddenly seemed sharp in some features and blurry in others, as if his mind couldn't be decided what it wanted to see. Ichigo's hazed caramel orbs focused on Shunsui, seeking gravity in the comforting presence of his captain. Taking in the curve of his jaw, tracing wispy threads of stubble, before his gaze came to rest on the flowery kimono draping the man's shoulders, Ichigo felt unaccountably tired, like he had tread the earth's surface for countless years. The young Shinigami stared mind-unseeingly blank, like a cavernous tomb had opened itself there and proceeded to lock away rationality. Distantly on some parallel plane, Ichigo knew he needed to sleep, and sleep properly. He barely grasped an hour's sleep in the past few days. It was evident in the specter listlessly drifting by the window, staring at the world with a soft smile on her face, the whimsical one she got when she talked of her dreams or killer robots. Of course, Ichigo on some deeper level knew that Orium wasn't really there. No, that's what the blood and lifeless corpses laid out at his feet were there to remind him of. But it was nice to see that smile again, even if it was only his imagination, a warning, or trick of his sleep-depraved mind. Ichigo couldn't sleep. There was an ache inside his soul and he knew not the cause. He wondered briefly if it was like those times when he would sink beneath a blanket of despair unmovable from such a prison for weeks, but this was deeper scarring and so incredibly heavy. It was pulling at him only in the insistent moments that he closed his eyes or when two fresh presences entered the room. Then the wearing tear of his past would claw itself to the forefront of his mind and viciously curse his thoughts with images of the wars he had lived. His own voice longed to reach out and confide the darkness of his night, scream it to the world so that he could be released of the burden he was shouldering unendingly. Ichigo knew he had people to talk to, but he wasn't willing to burden them with his own horrors, taint their time with wasted breaths. He also knew his family was there for him. It pulsed in his chest like a sapling planted with care and bursting forth to wrap tendrils of warmth around his core. They drove back the mind-numbing drowning sensations that were slowly choking the breath from his soul. It was irrational, but he felt like it should be kept a secret. Maybe it was how he had been molded into the man he was. Always taught to hide his weaknesses, never submit to them, power through the pain and heartache. Ichigo knew there was no hesitance in his soul, but this was something else, like chains wrapped around his ankles, cold and stealing, draining, pulling him beneath the waters of his inner world, the waters that were cool and nourishing in some fountain-like way. The chains wrapped around him in some dark place, the cries of carrion folk crying out, accompanied always by the wailing of the widows. Orium drifted closer, a slightly pained expression on her innocently cast features. He knew she wouldn't have wanted him to suffer like this. None of them would have, because they cared and loved him even though he had failed them. And didn't it caress his insides, make him want to burst with relief and gratitude that he was loved? After everything, they still loved him now in this timeline as in the past. Maybe he was punishing himself, for failing, for living. Maybe he just wished it could all be over so he could see them again. In the end, he knew he wasn't in the right state of mind, his thoughts tipping between a clarity he knew well and these hazy inseam thoughts that chased his will and soul. Why now? He wondered why it was that he had taken this metaphorical dive into uncharted waters, fallen off into the deep lurking abyss. The one that held prey to all manner of strangeness, and everything lurked with some hidden purpose. He supposed maybe it was an accumulation, a build-up of the stress he had undergone in teaching the Vizard and being surrounded by his family night and day. A family that had become part of his everything and who he had held the broken bodies of. It could have been the return to Soul Society itself, the sudden shock of once again being surrounded by presences of those who had entered Death's realm. It had been like that the first few months, but back then he had been overwhelmed by the situation and burning alive with the will to change it. Now he wondered if he left, would they be fine? Sosuke wasn't hell-bent on destroying Soul Society and becoming a deity among men, and the Suteiko knew the future, knew about the Quincy and how to save Soul Society. He couldn't leave though, not in the span of time limited as danger to his family. It was like he was trapped in a molded cage where to take a single step out of line could harm those who cast hollow masks over their features. It made the desire for an end all the starker because he couldn't stand being trapped, not when his whole life had been molded with polished strings. But he wasn't going to end it all, because he had reasons to live. Sometimes they were the small ones, like the tea served in that small corner of the 45th sector of Rungokai, or sometimes it was the knowledge that his sisters would still be born, that Rukia would be alive. He had to see them, see their smiles once more and know that they would be able to live. It could have been the month. June was always a hard month. It was when the world had shattered for him that first time. It was when he had lost his mother, the son to his world, to his families as well. Ichigo had buried that guilt long ago, but even now it gnawed at his heart. Still Ichigo had picked himself up, rose from the embankment of water tearing at his limbs with greedy hands, just as he rose every other time. Ichigo, you should speak with someone. Zanjitsu Asen suggested softly, the reverberating baritone of his voice settling the anxiety and endless churning in his core and mind. Ichigo slumped and opened his eyes. It was funny how he didn't even remember closing them, though the humor was short-lived. Orium was gone, the faint scent of orange blossoms careening away in the fields of his memories. Instead, in front of his eyes stood Chad. The gentle giant was hunched over, knowing eyes revealed. Something tugged fiercely at Ichigo's heart. It was the sorrow of a bond where one lived while the other was gone. Kami, he missed Chad, a man who he could tell anything to and trust his life with, his brother in all but blood. They had relied on each other countless times and their bond had deepened like a well reaching to the core of the Earth's center. Now he was gone, his presence not even existing yet, just like so many of the others. The ghostly impression of warmth drifted across Ichigo's cheek and he blinked away the blurriness, and focused on the large hand holding his cheek, the faint impression of a thumb caressing under his eye sending shivers cascading down his spine. Zanjitsu's recommendation to speak to someone was sounding more enticing by the minute, if only to release the pressure building behind his eyes and begging him to release the cries of his soul. He had to be careful though, the world couldn't bear witness to his endless secrets, he couldn't fall apart where greedy gazes could run home with the news of falling sanity. Ichigo took in a few deep breaths trying to clear his mind. It hadn't worked before and it didn't work now, instead he was given the tight yet loose sensation of his lungs expanding and holding the air within them. Playful and dark with aged fondness, Reisu sneaked out and curled against Ichigo's legs tenderly questioning him and radiating warmth. Ichigo looked up catching Shunsui's eyes from under the brim of his old straw hat. There was a fire in Coco's eyes that temporarily released the icy melancholia tying his soul to the earth's glacial peaks. Ichigo attempted a smile for his captain. It was soft and sincere, full of a quiet gratitude that Ichigo sometimes dwelled on for hours. He just thought about how wonderful it was to have people who cared, and loved him, though there always lingered that doubt, that fear of betrayal threaded into his being. When Ichigo lost all of that suddenly there was distance, a barrier, the idea that now this wonderful life-inspiring thing was gone, and that he was never going to get it back. Zanjitsu's Reisu hummed assuring him that they would never lose their wielder again, they may have left, and never of their own violation like others, but they always came back. A warm hand dropped onto his shoulder and Ichigo cocked his head haphazardly staring at Chad. The Mexican man was glancing down at Ichigo in the soft rough kind of way, the one that somehow reflected the golden light in Chad's soul, those eyes conveying to Ichigo everything he needed to know. Shunsui sighed, pushing a hand over his face while the other griped one of Katen Kyokotsu's pommels. Ichigo watched with no amount of surprise as Shunsui pulled out a bottle of sake. He considered the clear liquid in the fading sunlight. The first prick of evening's sails were chasing the sun. The man tipped the bottle towards Ichigo. The orange-haired Shinigami shook his head in the negative, ignoring the sigh and flash of disappointment flowing in wine-deep eyes, accompanied by the ever-present concern Shunsui showed for his lieutenant. The drink had been an offer Ichigo wasn't yet ready to take. He wasn't ready to let the pain of his soul be bared to a man who had once stood like a father to him. And he had seen what turning to the bottle did to a man without hope. He would suffer any day than fall into the deepening void that scowled back hungrily. He had dealt more than enough times with this Heinz alcohol-induced anger and words. Their eyes locked across the table as Shunsui poured himself a glass of sake. Ambient Reisu tangled and caressed against each other, stoking warmth to flood Ichigo's systems once more. "Go get some sleep, Ichi," Shunsui announced quietly, a faint pleading in his voice. Ichigo studied his captain once more in the silence, basking in the presence of Katen Kyokotsu and Shunsui's own Reisu. The youth considered spilling everything then and there, telling the man who had become like an uncle or father to him in the time they spent training in the same barracks, now just younger. Ichigo knew it wasn't the time, not yet. It would come and then he would tell them both, Jushiro ever understanding and Shunsui filled with deep empathy. He would see the acceptance on their features, but not now. Not when the shadows of Ichigo's mind played fruitfully with their images, twisting words spoken carelessly and pulling at Ichigo's wool. He couldn't confide when their death was bitter on his tongue. Ichigo nodded, shuffling out from the desk, and the youth placated the paperwork for a few moments, thoughts still drifting on lazy currents. Shunsui's presence drew close and Ichigo looked up, curious only to receive a hug. It was oddly comforting in that Ichigo had never been a fan of contact, especially not after what he'd lived through. Shunsui pulled back slightly, gazing into Ichigo's eyes with a soft, compelling warmth that hitched Ichigo's breath and left him feeling like he was a child, vulnerable yet taken care of. His captain chuckled softly before he leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss on Ichigo's brow. He settled in Shunsui's arms. The weight and ache of his sleeplessness wanted to drag his body into the ground, and the whirlwind of his emotions, anger, confusion, grief, sorrow, pain, despair, drowning him deeper in the pools of his mind. Instead he let their presences interact while he breathed in the familiar comforting fragrance of sake and ginger. They remained embraced for a timeless few moments, as if Shunsui was attempting to shield Ichigo from the demons in his head. The orange-haired Shinigami appreciated the gesture as he slumped further into Shunsui's arms, his attempts working as the pooling cold dispersed if only temporarily. Crystal-like wind chimes echoed in some far-off distance and beckoned Ichigo on. The air was charged tonight and he felt as if it had all finally reached a head. That the great and endless expansion of blue would rain down upon the world to herald a change that was likely nothing more than insignificant to the rest of the world. Yet would thunder into his own life and wreak havoc, tossing him about like a ship on the ocean. Shunsui ruffled Ichigo's locks, tightening his hold on Ichigo and wrapping him in layers of his reisu, before sending the kid to the door with a light push. Ichigo turned to Shunsui with a faint smile and a gentle wave before Ichigo slipped outside of the barracks. A heavy summer breeze listlessly drifted in the air, as Ichigo stepped outside, playfully ruffling Tangerine locks and sending them dancing across his sight. He stared for a moment, wondering at his next action. He could return to the Shiba home and try to get some sleep, but he doubted it would be a fruitful endeavor. Not with the way his heart beat restlessly in his chest and kicked up dregs of energy in the soles of his feet. Rationally he assumed that his mind was once again playing tricks on him, leading him to think that energy was flooding through his veins, but he also acknowledged that at this point he couldn't muster that same energy to care. Ichigo sighed and pulled his conscience within his frame from where it had drifted. He closed his eyes for a moment and then tipped his head back, looking at the softening blue of the sky above. It was a peaceful sight, one that ignited war within in his chest, as the peace instilled by the skies was balanced precariously against the inner turmoil simmering like the great tunnels of rock within the south. Tossing decisions and caution to the wind, Ichigo let his feet guide him aimlessly along the winding streets of Serieteti. His thoughts tripped and tumbled about his head, and the lengthening shadows around him seemed cold and callous, reaching for him with greedy claws to ensnare whatever light pulsed in his chest. Ichigo flinched as his gaze fell to the ground and lifeless blank eyes stared up at him. The corpse was horribly mutilated, but Ichigo thought he could still recognize purple strands. Nausea burned his throat, and he blinked away the hallucination harshly as his heart hammered in his chest, accompanied by shifting reisu. He needed to talk to someone, whether to assure himself that they were indeed hallucinations and that his family was alive, but they did die, and he had seen it, so didn't that make them real in the end? He couldn't be seen as weak within the public eye. He had to remain strong and blink away the chasing hallucination, if only long enough that the wizard would not suffer for his actions. Ichigo took a few deep breaths and rested against pale white walls, Zanjutsu's familiar reisu coiling around him in comforting waves. Ichigo knew who to talk to, or at least who he could figuratively talk to, because as much as the Suteiko knew the truth, Ichigo wasn't spilling his heart to the old man. His thoughts turned to his brother, understanding sea green eyes and those nights over the warmth of sake, someone who had been nothing but words and grief-stricken eyes in Ichigo's own timeline. But Kyan was still at work, and would be for a while if Ichigo recalled correctly. Honestly, Ichigo had little clue as to what was real, but he was managing, and he wouldn't separate the Shiba heir from his beloved work under Ju. That left Byakuya, who while still in the dark would be open to listening to Ichigo. Decision partially made, Ichigo straightened and pushed off from the wall, blinking disoriented at the wavering shapes in front of him. The sunlight piercing through the thick veil of clouds slowly crowning the sky made the world seem untamable, like a dream. Ichigo realized belatedly that his plan had a flaw. To Shiro's amusement, he had no idea where Byakuya was. As much as Jinrei could now tolerate Ichigo, the youth was not about to brace the IC noble's office if he knew for certain Byakuya wasn't there. Of Soul Society alone there were 1,000 other places Ichigo could check, but as he was still slightly sensible, he reasoned that he could use his reisu to find the ebony-haired Shinigami. Ichigo closed his eyes once more, letting his concentration solidify as his mind filled with thoughts of his friend, that small smile he shared with Ichigo when lightly amused, the deep rumble of his laughter like spring breaking forth, the call of his blade as they danced. Ichigo let his senses dart out, searching for the presence that always lingered with the feeling of sakura blossoms in a cool ice. A faint smile danced across Ichigo's lips when he located the presence of his friend in one of the inner Rungokai districts. Flicking his eyes open, Ichigo thought of the distance to the district and with a shrug decided he could walk. That decision was promptly rectified a few minutes later, as Ichigo's patience already weathered was lost and the Shinigami fluttered like a faint wisp of night in wicked fast flash step. The district was bustling with warm early nightlife, crowds of people flocking the streets and drifting aimlessly to and from the many vendors' stalls. Paper lanterns from the recent festival still littered the streets overhead in bright colors and cast the early evening brightly. The wafting scents of roasting meats, fresh fruits, and newly birthed blossoms drifted throughout the air in the heady mixture of Rungokai. It was a homely scent in some minute ways, reminding Ichigo of nights won in cold harsh deserts that prevailed to early morning and simple afternoons wandering what still stood. Even starker in his memories were the early morning markets of Karakura town, the ones he visited with his mother as they addled from stall to stall, and the ones he later brought his sisters to as they shopped for their household. The faces in the crowd, the ones that were achingly familiar staring with accusing eyes he ignored, turned a blind eye to the guilt curling inside his gut like a sleeping dragon. He knew his faults, they were only now here in front of him because of his own weakness. A false strength that had been strengthened in culture and life. To show weakness was wrong when in the end it was the strongest thing one could do in the presence of family. It showed you trusted them, displayed your strength and their strength, that one could be so free. That weakness was also covered because of circumstance. He couldn't afford to be seen faltering by the public. So, he walked paved streets with his head held high and the aches and sickness twisting his chest buried underneath layers of control. If his family and close friends were the only ones to notice, that was perfectly alright in Ichigo's books. Drifting in the sea of bodies for a few lost moments, Ichigo let the empty thoughts of his mind twist around his heart. He was okay, or at least he could be if he talked to someone. Zanjitsu whispered softly in Ichigo's ear, and Ichigo felt slight guilt that his Zanpakuto had to deal with a wielder such as him. He placated their outraged denials with a small self-depreciating smile but forged on through the crowds. Byakuya's presence sparked like liquid gold against the edge of Ichigo's senses. His brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to pinpoint the location of his friend among the 1,000 other signatures clawing for attention. When he closed his eyes and really opened his senses, he could see them all, the bright bursts of color, the subtle earth tones, the jewel-glimmering metals. Ichigo nodded to himself and parted through the crowd till he reached a small tea house carefully tucked away from the rustling crowds and other storefronts. There was a store beside it that sold a variety of foreign merchandise, and Ichigo was tempted to temporarily forego his quest to see Byakuya and enter the store, because they had some interesting things in the storefront and Ichigo really wasn't the best at making decisions at the moment. Shiro scoffed before he devolved into giggles, which sounded unusual in Ichigo's mind. Once the hollow spirit had calmed himself down, he chided Ichigo and urged him to find Byakuya. Zanjitsu Asen seconded the idea and Ichigo shook his head in faint fond amusement before he turned his attention to the tea house. There was a short driveway to the tea house. The building itself was the kind nobles would likely visit, with faint reds imbued in the dog material, large ornate arches fitting of the noble palaces in the mortal realm. Under the eaves of a curved overhanging structure Ichigo spotted Byakuya cloaked in shadows, the glow of the oil lamps catching the metal of his Kenseikin and sending it soaring like stars. Ichigo moved to step forward before he paused. Another figure was with Byakuya. In the half-light of the evening imbued by cloudy darkness, Ichigo saw the faint shift of fabric in a smaller diminished form. Curious and slightly disappointed, Ichigo silenced his Reisu where it raced antsily against his skin and moved to the side to see clearer. Ichigo's mouth opened in silent shock as for a hurricane moment the lighting convinced Ichigo that he was staring at Rukia, and that wasn't possible because while his hallucinations were there, and he had seen her form, felt the chill ice of her presence encase his neck like a noose, they did not interact with the technically living. Another shift of fabric and Ichigo sighed in half-hearted relief as he realized the figure was not Rukia but her older sister Hisuna. Oh, Ichigo realized things in a slow concussive emotion that trembled throughout his frame in a blinding whirlwind that left his hands shaking and the wish to hide. Byakuya was here on a date with Hisuna. While the fact in itself wasn't overly surprising, Ichigo wondered why his chest was hurting so much so suddenly. It was as if Urayu, for all his false impudent mockery and threats, had fired one of his Quincy arrows through Ichigo's heart. The pain, while not excruciating, throbbed in a dull sort of unbearable ache and Ichigo had no idea why. Zanjitsu Asen's presence swept over his Reisu, helping to contain the bursts that rose up in heady arcs from his skin. It was as if the world had blacked out, the sun destroyed in that moment as his plan had fallen into a black hole of nothingness gravity. Ichigo, on a subconscious level, and Shiro's chiding, knew he was being a touch over dramatic, but that didn't take away from the panic in his Reisu and the pain flooding his eyes. He knew she was Hisuna, but she looked almost exactly like Rukia, and Kami. It hadn't hit him before, but the fact that she was here meant that Rukia was out there alive somewhere. Somehow the pain in his heart was too much to bear at that thought. Words bubbled up in his throat. He wanted to rush forward, pull Byakuya aside and tell him everything, take off running and never touch the ground again. He loved his friend too much to do that. Byakuya deserved happiness, deserved the time with Hisuna, however short. As much as Ichigo had impacted Byakuya's life, taught him how to be free as a noble, given him laughter and misadventures. Byakuya had also given extraordinarily to Ichigo. The man had sacrificed time and energy to break down Ichigo's walls with a gentle hand. He had seen the blinding scathing pain of nightmares and had smiled, had locked Senbonzakura with Zanjutsu, and instead of hate or malice Ichigo had sensed a plethora of positive emotions that left him breathless in wonder. It had been so long since he had felt that connection. By the end of the war there had been no one to have a friendly spar with, no one to pit his soul against that wasn't an enemy. Already by the second half of the war, with numbers dwindling, there had been no space for it, and when there was, it was hollow like their wielders. Ichigo had missed the sensation, that undeniable warmth that flooded his system like adrenaline. Now in this timeline he was helping to shape. He could raise his blade to spar and feel that they were alive and well. They weren't the same family he had come to know. Shunsui was younger, less weathered by loss. Shinji was still a subtle manipulative bastard, but Sakanda was happy, a goddess of golden sands reinstated. Kisuke was open in a way that left Benihime crowing for blood. Byakuya still held that ever-present grace of Sakura, the kind that soothed Ichigo's senses. The ice was gone. That shell that had taken forever to be cast aside and even then left traces, was wholly unfounded, and Ichigo basked in the warmth of Byakuya's soul clashing against his through their blades. It was because of the bond between them that Ichigo stared for a moment longer, savoring their presences, watching as Byakuya leaned in and caressed Hisona's cheek with a tender smile, before he turned away. His feet led him while his mind collapsed upon itself, stirring long-kept secrets to the surface in a catalyst of Reisu to surface beneath his skin. Everything hurt. They were staring at him, an endless line of bodies that he killed. Some faint rational part crowed that he should sleep or return home, but the noise only joined the endless torrent of screaming pounding against his heart. He thought he could hear Zanjutsu's cries, but they were faint under the overwhelming surges of Reisu escaping through the seal and tearing at the blurring land around him. His resolve was crumbling. The endless will to remain strong in front of others was clawing at his chest to escape, and with it pulling the ever life-beating organ into the open. His gaze wildly swept around, taking in the semi-crowded streets and the nearby presences of Shinigami. He couldn't afford to fall here. Shinji's bleeding corpse taunted him with shallow lifeless eyes as it pointed and whispered in his ear of the danger he would bring with his actions, how it would be his fault once more, how they would all fall. History would repeat itself and they would be banished if not executed, except he would be the cause. He shouldn't be sick in the first place. If someone found him, it could be all over for the Vizard. Turbulence would split the Ivory City in two. Ichigo's breathing picked up, rattling in his chest as he thought of the pain he could cause. He had to get away so that if anything were to happen, if he were to fall sick, he could do so in quiet and return when he was better. To protect the Vizard, his family, he would suffer alone, for an eternity if he had to. He would do it for them all, no matter how much his Zanpakuto insisted they didn't deserve it. The sky was darkening as Ichigo's feet carried him into a mess of forest spent near one of the outer districts. It was utterly silent, as if all the earth had succumbed to the waves of despair welling inside him. It hurt to see them, and he had no idea why. He could guess some of the causes, but it was nowhere near enough to explain the pain splitting his core. It felt as if he had lost again. He was fine, he chanted to himself, willing his soul to remain glued together with faded memories and patched sunlight, because he couldn't fall. Ichigo gripped Zanjutsu's pommel, lacking the familiar sensations of his spirits. He chanted under his breath. Rukia's petite form curled in the boughs of the trees, staring at him accusingly, challenging him to give up. He searched for Zanjutsu's presence blindly, as if swimming through the clouds of ink that floated in the end of borders. The thought seated itself in his mind. Maybe everything was an hallucination. This was just the dying dreams of the only soul left to care for a broken world. Ichigo's Reisu snapped from his form, restrained from fully escaping only by the weakness of his own body and the seal, the ache, and weariness of his soul pulling at a galaxy of reserves. Ichigo's presence cut and ripped at the earth, sending soil careening into the air, flying like a maelstrom. Trees were torn from the earth's unwilling grasp, leaves fluttering to the ground, blanketing it. At once the presence died away as Ichigo slumped to the earth, leaning against a great rowan tree still standing in the onslaught of his presence. Dry, empty trembling shook Ichigo's form as he curled into himself, pulling at his shiakusho in distress, orange shading hazy amber orbs from the world Ichigo wished he could hide from. The youth was infinitely lost. Ichigo felt as if he was drifting endlessly, pulled between a reality where he had lost everything and all that happened was merely the last attempts of a desperate mind, and a hope that it was real, because how could it be real? He had traveled to the past for a reason he couldn't yet discern. He had convinced Aizen to abandon the path of a deity and saved the wizard from a fate of banishment. It was his fault. Was this some punishment, a hope only to be teared away in the end? Ichigo knew it was his fault, as much as he lied to himself and told himself he didn't believe that it was his fault, all those deaths and destruction. The reason in this semblance of a life he struggled to even raise his soul from the bed was the deep weight of guilt, and sorrow, and grief pulling at him endlessly. He had held their dying bodies. Every single one of them multiple times over, cherished their last words, saw the light flee their eyes, flee him as he let another soul die under his watch. Kami, he was so useless. He might have well killed them for all he could do. Yuzu and Karen were there now, those soft and naive smiles that only children could possess, and the adoration they felt for their big brothers illuminating glassy corpse eyes. Their words were echoing in his head, chasing his thoughts, carved into his skin in permanent ink that he couldn't scrape away no matter how desperately he clawed at his skin. Yuzu's comforting words that it wasn't his fault, Karen's hopeless accusing eyes because at the end of it all she had lost hope, lost everything when Toshiro took a blow for her. He would never hold their bodies again, never comb their hair away and kiss their foreheads the way he once had. Ichigo would never rest in Chad's large protective form after a tiring day where the specters of Karakura were calling to him. There would never be the dog piles at the end of the days of war, where their limbs would tangle and Reisu would surge and meld till they were sharing their sorrow and happiness. He would never hold his mother's hands, taste Orium cooking, share sake with this Hein and reminisce, would never laugh with Shunsui about the rumors, share medical tips with Jushiro. Not the way he had, never in the way their bonds had developed. Ichigo wasn't their older brother, wasn't some punk kid who had charged his way into their lives and smiled like a madman. A cry surged from his lips, because he would never see their smiles like they had smiled for him. They were gone and he would never touch their souls again. A near-splitting roar shook the land as Reisu swirled once more in mirthless currents that screamed a warning to all living. Ichigo remained immobile, the presence dim and tapered to his spluttering soul, the scream only joining the cacophony within his mind. The ground cracked and thundered like the sky above as rainy sheets began to cascade towards the earth, hoping to drown the sorrows of one of its children. A tear ripped itself within the rain-slicked sky, dark currents of fathomless night racing about, and from within a pale disk of white appeared. Dark crimson Reisu, stained with the malign ants of hate, crackled out from the Garganta, spilling out into the surrounding areas and reaching into far-off reaches as the almost Espada-level Minos Grande stepped forth into Soul Society. Ichigo shakily raised his head from its place between his knees where he had been spiraling deeper into the endless void of his mind, only managing to remain still by controlling his breathing. Ichigo stared at the large figure lumbering towards him in that slow drifting movement like the creature was light as air, its pale blood-red eyes beamed sharply in the sheets of rain surrounding them. A cruel grin split the creature's face as it reached Ichigo, staring at the young Shinigami with a hunger in its presence. Ichigo remained limp against the rough bark of the rowan. What did it matter anymore if nothing was real in the end? Dully Ichigo could feel Zanjitsu's Reisu snapping around him, trying to call out to their wielder, but Ichigo was deaf to their voices, lost in the splintered shards of his mind. A large pale fist grasped Ichigo's form, the massive hand easily dwarfing Ichigo's only too small body. The Minos Grande raised Ichigo till he was considering the eyes of the beast. He could almost see the same lifelessness there that reflected in his own eyes. He wondered if there was any point in struggling, if anything was even real. All he could feel was the cold pulling at his soul, wanting to drag him into the encroaching darkness, an endless numbing traveling through his body and settling around his heart, the last rave of warmth. The Minos Grande roared, grip tightening impossibly hard around Ichigo as it clenched its clawed hand into a fist. Ichigo gasped as sharp jerk of pain shot through his system, clearing his thoughts if only temporarily. He wiggled slightly in the creature's grasp, Zanjitsu's voice gaining volume and rising above the slightly tamed voices screaming at him within his mind. Zanjitsu's familiar weight formed in his hands, and with a sharp bite of Reisu the creature loosened its hold on Ichigo so that the Shinigami could spring free. Ichigo released himself and faced the Minos Grande, images of his first time facing one flashing relentlessly through his mind. All the anger and emotions swelling inside him fueled into his blade, arcing about Ichigo in heavy hits of black as he raised Zanjitsu, the care he once held to remain hidden falling away, as the blade slipped from its sealed state into Zanjitsu Shiro's blade, the uncontained raw power of Ichigo's untampered soul and emotions released in a final thrust. Getsuga Tensho. Ichigo breathed quietly, his power racing from the blade to slam into the hollow creature before slicing clean through its form and leaving wisps of inky black to dissipate in the rain. The moment the last drop of Ichigo's power rent itself from Zanjutsu's blade, the voices returned in full force, accompanied by the howling voices of the dead. Ichigo fell to the water-soaked earth slowly, landing softly against the base of the rowan tree, boneless and limp. Ichigo felt like a marionette doll, too still and unable to move a muscle to defend himself against the swelling darkness. He felt so tired, as if he could close his eyes and it would be over. The ever-present cold was seeping into his bones, chasing his veins and encircling his heart like a pack of wolves. It radiated with the pain and the only tether to a reality he was sure existed, if only because he couldn't imagine the love that had been gifted to him, was his grasp on Zanjutsu's hilt. Slow crescents of Reisu lazily circled the blade and Ichigo's form in a desperate attempt to reach their master. Looking up, Ichigo settled slightly in the inevitability of the moment, studying the gray-swept sky above, clouded in wispy strands of smoke. Ichigo could almost see it, the infinity of the world stretching around him. His Reisu, the part of him that touched the world, revealed itself like a second layer, superimposing itself over reality. It still beat inside his breast, the need to talk to someone, but it was tamed by the thousands of pulsating lights glimmering like stars between his eyes, the caress of a wind unfound tickling orange locks. Ichigo's shallow breaths rattled in his chest as the rain danced around his form and his thoughts tumbled from breathless lips in a mantra of apologies and names. X. Chapter 28, Raison d'être. X. Kion was worried. That was an understatement. He was damn well panicking. The only thing keeping him still and tethered to the earth was Nejibana's soothing presence rustling against his skin. Kion's instincts were screaming at him, battering against his senses and sending flares of protectiveness careening through his system. Something was wrong. He trusted his instincts enough to know that when he was this alert, this distraught, it could only be the truth. Kion flitted along the familiar path to the Shiba home, darting under great sentinels, knowing that once he arrived his fears could be put to rest. Those nagging instincts had chased Kion from Yukatake Teiko's office at the end of the day, and straight towards Kiriraku Teiko's office. Kion's heart had stopped in his chest the moment he felt the lack of Ichigo's familiar presence. Shunsui must have seen the blatant concern and fear on Kion's features, as the older captain was quick to calm the lieutenant's racing heart. Now Kion swayed between a sick worry and the lingering threads of hope that Ichigo would be safe at home. He had only missed the orange-haired Shinigami by 20 minutes, so Kion prayed that Ichigo's infallible luck had not landed him in some dubious trouble. The roll of Reisu against skin and the ominity of the cloudscape hovering above, struck softly at Kion's heart, bringing to the forefront of his mind the orange-haired youth. Kion had noticed Ichigo's falling state with a heavy brow and downturned lips. Ichigo had no visible reason for such a sudden twist, but Kion's mind whispered other ideas, grating thoughts of nightmares, and sleepless nights under the moonlit desert. Of days in the beginning where Ichigo could not move himself from slumber. Is Heinji had approached Kion the other night, adding to Kion's plans already set in stone of talking to Ichigo. Kion was going to do such tonight, come hell or high waters. Nijibana whispered softly in his mind, the calm of still lakes submerging the deep-seated panic that left him short of breath. The Shiba heir paused to lean against a lean oak tree for a moment, attempting to work himself out of the deepening worry and fear he had pulled himself into. The kind of state he always worked himself into when it came to Ichigo. He couldn't help it in the end, not when he thought of their first meeting drenched in rain and touched melancholy. The air itself had burnt with the taste of power and sorrow. The bright spark of orange like a dying ember that had suddenly invaded his life and grown to a fire that filled it with a warmth he wanted. Just thinking of his little brother's smiles always brought light to his eyes and a mirroring reflection to his own lips. But when he thought of Ichigo happy without the weight of the world on his shoulders, over those quiet moments of sake and the endless horizon of stars overhead, he felt lighter than the tranquil feathers drifting in graceful motions towards the earth. When he saw those expressions on Ichigo's features, it struck him that he was able to help heal the youth. Maybe he was one of the few who could, with the way Ichigo protected himself, but it only made the matter closer to his heart. Now, for an unidentifiable reason, he chalked it up to big brother instincts. He could almost sense that Ichigo was in trouble, was somewhere far away and yet near in that way he often was. Except this time, they could lose him to the wispy stones that disappeared underfoot on the pathways of his mind he often retreated to, his inner sanctuary, sometimes more of a cage than a haven. Ichigo was still like a child in some ways, Kion reflected fondly. As much as Ichigo was strong, Older than when they first met, and wise beyond the years he claimed to possess, Kyan knew Ichigo had lied about his age. Younger souls after all had a feeling about them, a potential. But he was also naive in some ways, misunderstanding interpretations, confusion as they talked about one topic or the other. He was lost like a small child that couldn't see the light for the clamoring shadows surrounding him. That didn't take away from who Ichigo was in the slightest. It was a part of him, an innocence that wasn't really innocence, just a part of Ichigo's personality, the endearing mannerisms that fluctuated like the seasons. One moment the soft cool winter calm and collected, the next the burning summer sun scorching all with a fiery temper. Kyan pushed off from the tree, gaze drawn to the swollen sky above. Crescents and curves of gray whipped about and interchanged to form a breathtaking mosaic of warning. Kyan embraced the charged atmosphere, echoing rain, a weather pattern he adored. It reminded him of his inner world and the beads of water that clung to Nejibana's kimono or grasped the wavy strands of her hair. The lieutenant pushed aside tangling ebony locks and focused on the task at hand, his heart temporarily settled, yet the grievances his soul uttered heavy in his thoughts. In a sharp, efficient manner Kyan resumed flash step and hastily retreated towards the Shiba mansion. Kyan had a mini heart attack upon arriving home. Ichigo's presence was nowhere within Kyan's senses. The home buzzed with the other Shiba members, Kukeku's fire-quenched soul, Ganju's earthy kindness, but not Ichigo. While this wasn't ultimately a surprising fact considering the numerous times the kid managed to suddenly suppress all of his vast presence, it still cut at Kyan like a knife, as he stormed into the compound following his sister's blazing presence, pulsing with worry. Kyan arrived at the door as it slammed open to reveal his younger sister's distraught features. They lightened upon seeing Kyan, the fond traces of love echoing softly between the two before the darkness appeared with heavy peals of thunder, and she pulled Kyan inside. "Have you seen him?" Kukeku questioned insistently, eyes blazing like dragon fire in the shadowed interior of the entrance. The servants were nimbly moving on soundless feet and lighting the swaying oil lamps. Fear gripped Kyan's senses like the pommel of a sword as he raised drawn sea-green eyes and asked in return, "He's not home." Kukeku shook her head, a desperate sort of denial clinging to her features as her hand fisted into Kyan's shiksho. Kyan froze, soft trembling motions shaking his arms as he felt the world around him spin to a stop. This was bad, levels of bad akin to the Suteiko deciding to retire. Shunsui had related to Kyan Ichigo's condition, and last Kyan had seen Ichigo he had been pale as early frost and twice as lifeless. According to Kairo Raku, the youth had only tumbled further down the scale of looking like death. Even Kyan's penchant for drama could hardly exaggerate Ichigo's state. Nejibana's gentle chiding insisted otherwise. "Damn it!" Kyan muttered under his breath. He should have taken greater incentive to care for Ichigo. It was his job as an older brother. He should have gotten off work early so they could walk home together. He should have paid closer attention to Ichigo's presence. He should. Nejibana's Reisu roared like the towering tsunamis they were capable of in their anger, drowning out the thoughts of guilt and self-doubt, even as Kukeku's slender hand grasped the curves of his cheek and she tilted his head up from where it had fallen to cast desolate eyes toward the ground. "We're all at fault, but right now we need to focus on Ichi. He was insanely tired and he could be hallucinating, lost, anything, so we need to find him." Kyan nodded as Nejibana's presence washed over him in waves, pulling back the levels of guilt and the worry, leaving cresting determination in its wake. Distantly a part of him wanted to yell at Ichigo, be furious at the youth for letting it come to this, while another part wanted to wrap the firehead up in his arms and never let the youth go till Ichigo had divulged all of his secrets, the ones he kept to his breast like a mothering animal protected its cub. For now, he settled on finding Ichigo. Resting a hand over Kukeku's warm one lingering on his cheek, he nodded, gratitude in his eyes, and that love he held for his sister shimmering alongside it. She always had a way in directing them where they needed to be and setting them straight. Heck, she had marched up to Ichigo one day, viciously poked him in the chest and demanded he go and talk to Anohana. The audience of the spectacle has tensed, wondering what reaction Ichigo would grace them with. He was like a lottery, one never knew what they were going to get. To the unanimous surprise, but also not really, he had slumped his shoulders, pouted a bit, but agreed. Shaking away idle musings, Kyan pulled himself together and nodded, promise heavy like the crashing waves within his soul. Heaving a sigh, thoughts darkening sea-stone eyes, he breathed deeply before saying, "I'll find him, but be prepared for a worst-case scenario." Kukeku flinched at the implication but nodded, eyes lost and young beneath raven waves. Sometimes Kayan forgot that Kukeka was the younger of the two with the maturity she carried. Leaning down, Kayan placed a quick kiss to her brow and wrapped his resu around her, humming with reassurance and home, before he turned and strode from the compound into the howling winds that tore at his clothing and hair. Stretching his senses out, Kayan searched for a spark of Ichigo's presence, anything to indicate where the flame-haired Shinigami might be. Kayan's shoulders tilted down in distress when he identified nothing. He cursed whoever had taught Ichigo how to hide his resu so well, because Ichigo could make it seem like he wasn't even there, not even the barest whisper of a presence. Nijibana softly nudged his thoughts along the right path, encouraging him to find a solution to the sudden pitfall in his plans. Kayan racked his mind for a moment, filled only with the baying of the world around him. His senses still stretching out, racing along the plains of Soul Society, snagged on a familiar presence, one that sung with nobility and hung with the faint hint of sakura blossoms. Ideas springing to life within his mind, Kayan cast one last searching gaze at the Shiba mansion, before he tilted his head towards the overcast sky and prayed to Kami that Ichigo was okay. Byakuya was thankfully not a master at hiding his resu. Kayan supposed that was one positive in the shitstorm of a situation they found themselves in. Kayan hoped beyond all things possible that the Kukeki heir had seen Ichigo, or at least had an inkling of his presence. If not, Kayan would have to resort to scavenging Ichigo's many hiding places scattered throughout Soul Society, which would only waste time, and that was something Kayan couldn't afford to waste. The two were as closely knit as any bonded by friendship could be, and Kayan hoped that Ichigo had decided to depend on that bond and visit Byakuya, because he could trust Byakuya. Hell, Kayan had listened once as Ichigo on one of their exceptionally fruitful drinking nights had rattled on about Byakuya for a good half hour, just prattling about how Ichigo was grateful, and also how stupid Kensei-kin were. The earth blurred beneath his feet as he launched into a whip-paced shunpo scaling along the paths to Rungokai and its many districts. Nijibana hummed around him as the world around Kayan disappeared into wispy shreds and haunting imagery. Panting slightly in faint exertion as he arrived, Kayan's sea eyes cast around like a hawk, picking out the figures in a rapidly dwindling crowd. The cast of people milling about were steadily dispersing at the nasty weather looming overhead, and cracking like the chariots of war. It had been a nice day too, Kayan remarked as he cut through the droves of people, one with soft blue quilting the sky in a peaceful summer breeze. He had ventured to the markets with Lisa and Rangiku on his lunch break, the two still working lieutenants helping to walk Lisa to her home before strolling to the bar for a drink and a bite of food. The cheery atmosphere of the festival had been contagious but slightly undermined by the rattling feelings chasing him. Kayan's eyes landed on his destination, noting the curved arches and elegant framework nestled in between two other buildings that he spared only a flash of his sight. He vaguely remembered visiting the place a few times with his father or his Hinji for official Shiba clan business. It had always been incredibly boring, and no matter the effort Kayan strived to listen, his attention always drifted. He wondered why the young Kukeki was here when for all he knew Kukeki Teiko was still slaving away over paperwork. Kayan cussed lightly as the sky opened up in a slow manner, large fat drops colliding with the earth before they increased in intensity and number till the world itself was drenched in sheets of water. Hurrying under the curved arches, Kayan almost laughed at the feeling of running through the rain. He missed the days when as children they had eagerly burst outside to clamber through the mud and puddles. Sliding the light door of the restaurant open, Kayan stepped inside and sighed softly at the gust of warmth drifting on the air currents, accompanied by the rich sense of veritably preferred meals of high elegance. Kayan's eyes swept around the room sharp as a jackknife, muscles coiled tensely before his eyes landed on a head of raven. Spiking his presence sharply so as to draw Byakuya's attention, Kayan waited in the eaves of the doorway, eyes observing the various occupants of the room. The normal plethora of nobles were gathered within the room, accompanied by random couples dining under candlelight. The glamorous robes adorning the nobles shimmered in the oil lamplight, accompanied by the women of the room's dainty hair perched upon their head like a crown with different hair pieces of valuable metals sparkling. In the tables clustered in the back, Kayan could spot tables crowded with wizened old men and heavy smoke, the dull air of senility hanging there like a cloak over air. Sharp sea-stone eyes landed on the figure sitting beside Byakuya as the youth's head whipped around before his eyes widened, and possessing the ever-present Kukeki grace he rose to his feet and hurried over, though he appeared to glide rather than hurry. The women who had been eating with Byakuya possessed a petite frame with a delicate or fragile air about her. Glowing indigo orbs shone in a gentle manner from underneath a crown of raven hair. Kayan wondered who the women could be, having never seen her at the numerous noble galas cursedly occurring throughout the years. Kian tucked away the questions and his inquisitive nature as Byakuya approached him, a pensive look cast about his features as he bit his lip pensively. "Kian, what is it?" Byakuya began speaking informally as he closed the greater distance between them so that they were shadowed under the eave of the entrance and away from prying eyes and ears. Kian frowned, glowing sea orbs hard before they softened slightly, the worry and concern that was bubbling beneath his skin escaping to the surface for a brief moment before he asked, "Have you seen Ichigo?" Byakuya frowned, a whirlwind of emotions passing over his features ranging from confusion to worry. The young Shinigami straightened his spine slightly in the presence of a warrior preparing for battle, eyes distant in thought before he slowly shook his head. A moment later his head whipped up, eyes scrutinizing before he replied, "I haven't seen him, but, earlier this evening I swore I felt his presence." "What's wrong? Where's Ichigo?" Byakuya helpfully supplied, before a faint panic overtook his features, breaking the Kukaki mask as he frantically spat out the questions. Kian held a hand up, letting it rest on the other's shoulder in a comforting motion. He sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose with his other hand before tiredly running it through a messy mane of raven. He felt as if the world had sunk its way into his spine. He had no idea how to find Ichigo now and could only hope for a sign as he stretched his senses out as far they reached in the hopes of catching a whisper of Ichigo's presence. Turning his focus once more to Byakuya, Kian shook his head and answered, "Ichigo's missing. He left work early today but never made it home." "Don't worry, I'll find him. You get back to your date. Just do you have any idea where he might be?" Kian intoned faintly, emotions guiding his words and bringing to light the situation. Byakuya drew in a sharp inhale, eyes wide before his Reisu danced restlessly around them, slipping beneath Byakuya's skin beneath one moment and the next. "I should come with you." Kian sharply shook his head and Byakuya slumped before continuing, He might be in one of the outer dist." Lightning flashed sharply, accompanied by the crackle of thunder as the loud noise sent vibrations reaching through Kian's soul. At that moment Ichigo's presence flared as another more malevolent presence speared sharply into existence. Cursing sharply, Kian gently pushed the other in the direction of the tables where the lady was waiting and hissed out, "Go, don't worry, I'll find him." Kian spared no thought for Byakuya after that, thoughts solely focused on Ichigo. He darted out of the restaurant, uncaring of the pouring rain as it drenched him and plastered his hair to his forehead. Reisu stretching out wildly, Kian locked onto Ichigo's presence, hidden in a way that didn't seem possible and thrumming with untempered emotions. Kian choked at the overwhelming grief and sorrow surging there, the sense of loss ripping at his soul. Grasping Nejibana's pommel, Kian breathed in, drawing on the boundless calm of the oceans, the still waters providing peace flowing through his veins and sharpening his senses. The rain around him ceased its endless noise and distraction, falling apart under Kian's will. The lieutenant surged forward, whipping through mud and earth on his path towards Ichigo, a frantic prayer mumbled under his breath. Kian stumbled upon Ichigo resting against a great rowan tree, in a land pockmarked by Reisu and some great force, fire-bright hair beaded with sweat, eyes glassy with pain. In that moment Kian wanted to sweep his little brother into a hug and never let go, stifle his soul in Kian's own so that Ichigo would never have to experience the pain he was drowning in. Kian stopped himself, quelling rising paranoia by drawing on Nejibana's calm presence, her own Reisu lingering with the mirroring emotions they felt for Ichigo. Kian strode into the clearing in a slow, purposeful manner, careful to draw out every movement and let his Reisu dance across his skin, even as his heart stuttered a dangerous staccato. Ichigo's head snapped up, amber eyes sharp and almost feral, yet somehow conveying an emptiness that pulled like the void. Before he recognized Kian and the fight drained from his body, he slumped lifelessly against the tree behind him like a marionette without string and broken joints. Kian's heart wept inside his chest at the pitiful and painful sight of his proud, strong, younger brother cast so helplessly, because Ichigo wasn't weak. Even allowing Kian to see him like this tugged softly at the warmth of Kian's heart before it was submerged by the endless rain drumming around them and sweeping the land from beneath their feet in muddy streams. Kian swept forward in the shadow-cast clearing with urgency plaguing his steps, and crouching in front of his brother the Shiba air lifted the crown of orange bowed with the weight of far too many secrets, and the encroaching darkness. Ichigo's eyes were half-lidded as they gazed at Kian in a hazy whirl of amber like cloudy glass, unbearably weak and tired. The light, however tamed, always presented a faint spark, suddenly so dim it seemed tempted to flicker out at any second. "Kian! His voice was rough and low as if he'd screamed and yelled at the gods above 1,000 times over, shouting his pain for the world to hear in a place forgiven to nature. Kion chose not to reply, letting his presence answer the younger's questions. He leaned forward slightly and rested his forehead against Ichigo's, the weight and presence of his Reisu light but reassuring. Duly in the back of his mind he recalled Kukeiko's words speaking of the hallucinations Ichigo had been caught seeing. He wondered if that was why the teen looked at him in soft disbelief. He wondered what chased his sight that Kion could not see. "Ichigo dear one, when did you last sleep?" Kion questioned honestly. He too had seen the way Ichigo flinched at nothing, shadows embarking to terrorize him in daylight, and in the night his bed was empty. He sat above them all staring at the moon, eyes empty in a way so distantly longing and forlorn, as if he was almost seeing the loved ones he sometimes spoke of to Kion in early morning under sake sweet night's fading shadows. Ichigo cracked a faint smile so broken and weak that Kion felt like crying at the bitterness encased in that one gesture, felt the water of his soul rise up to pain his eyes and threaten to course down his cheeks like a waterfall. "Actually sleep? I've slept some here and there, but it's only an hour, more if I'm lucky. How can I sleep? How when their cold corpse eyes are taunting me, the Shinigami I doomed, lifeless icy hands tearing at the sanctuary of my mind and sleep to pull me deeper or free me into heaved waking? Even then in daylight the ghosts are following me, drifting through my thoughts and provoking hellfire to spike and ravage till I am drifting lost in wispy shrouds." Kion was slightly confused by the tangle of words, things he had never heard Ichigo speak of, and the drifting manner of his speech. But Kion pushed the lingering emotions away, daring to focus on Ichigo. He swept a hand up and in a soft familial motion brushed tangled orange locks out of Ichigo's eyes. The air was damp like his own eyes, and Kion cursed circumstance, that such heavy rains that chill the earth and sink everything down with water, would choose this day to fall upon them. Ichigo's lips were near blue. He looked like a being forged of ice, the shivers of his arms and trembling of his hands not mere memories, this time displaying the fragility of his soul. Kion wanted to curse the stupid fool for disappearing on him, leaving him and the others so damned worried. But he remained there for a quiet moment like amber preserving something in time, knowing that it wasn't the time to chide the youth. Nejibana's roll of Reisu fluttering playfully with raven strands assured him of the thought and tamed brewing emotions. Staring into wide amber orbs, Kion smiled endearingly while softly stroking Ichigo's cool skin. He stated in a pleading tone, "Ichigo, you need to sleep." Ichigo blinked a few times, as if trying to process the words like they were received but distorted through vast quantities of water. Though the rain around them was uproarious and sound deafening, there seemed a space between them where words were unobstructed. Ichigo cocked his head as if questioning the words running them over in his mind before he began furiously shaking his head. When he opened his eyelids, the orbs beneath them were wild and manic with a deep hysteria spiking suddenly. Ichigo choked on his breath for a moment, hands fisting the cloth of Kion's shiakusho before he stuttered out in a collapsed whisper, "No, I can't, they haunt me. Kion. I want it to be over. Why won't it end? Why must I suffer like this, years upon years of a life that should have ended long ago, faced constantly with the visage of the dead? It pulls and drags at my soul in a way that is so achingly tiring, and I just want it to stop. The days where the world is wrong and I can't muster the energy to move, the days where it's one flashback after another leaving me shaking and weak. I want to be healed or have this form fall to ruin so that my soul might find peace." Kion's eyes stung at Ichigo's voice so broken and dejected. As the youth abruptly sunk further into the rough bark of the tree, all energy and movement cut away in the last threads of desperation. Kion grasped Ichigo's shaking hands where they clenched at his shiakusho shakily, imbuing his hands with the inner warmth of soul and the churning Reisu of the sea. He let that warmth travel from his hands into Ichigo's, trying to impart a shred of heat to the cooled skin. Avoiding the numerous questions swirling like the desert storms within his mind, Kion focused on one question at a time, trying to get his little brother to open up. He asked, "Ichigo, why do they haunt you?" The fractured soul looked up from where his head had come to tilt towards the ground. He stared for an infinite moment, their souls connecting in jagged strands that stole Kion's breath. A fire was brewing in Ichigo's eyes. It was the same Greek fire that could burn upon the waves in the south. It was explosive and temperamental, boding dangerously in Kion's mind. Ichigo surged to his feet suddenly, leaving Kion to scramble for purchase as his support was now striding forward to gaze at the sky above where the rain was picking up, thrust upon them like the tears of a vengeful god cascading down Ichigo's cheeks in a false imitation of the tears Ichigo refused to shed. "I hate the rain. It's always there heading the end, Ichigo began softly, voice echoing in the clearing rising above the rain. He continued, "They haunt because I let them. I can't let go. My past is what makes this future. How can I move forward without resolve? It's a broken logic surely, but one that has worked in a world torn about by fire. But this world isn't broken rubble and endless emptiness, is it?" Ichigo's babbling heart poured from his lips, eyes bright in the sudden crack of lightning splitting the sky in chaotic streaks and illuminating his stark visage. He was like a natural disaster personified, hair and eyes wild, skin pale as death, and the myriad of colors weaving around him. "Ichigo, you need to let it go. Your past is behind you. Don't you see the future is ahead? We can be your resolve. You don't need to hold on to the will of the dead. You don't need to let it weigh you down. You can move forward without the sorrow of your memories." Kion interjected softly, attracting Ichigo's attention as the youth whipped around Reisu, piping along his skin and trailing along the ground in seams of crimson. Kion didn't flinch as the Reisu brushed against his own, coiling around it in a tender caress. Ichigo's hair flicked around his head, Shiakusho rustling as desperate and desolate eyes clashed against Kion's heart. "You don't get it, so few do, and even then, they don't understand. Your future is my past. I see the dead every day. I knew them, loved them, and they walk by me and don't know my soul, and even then, I am taunted by the dead not yet born as waking specters. We shared long nights, cups of sake, and years captured within months, and the blood of their bodies rests on my hands, coats my soul because I carry their wills, their dreams within me. The dreams and wills of people who may never be born because I interfered. Or who will never dream of such because they live in a world without broken creatures tearing concrete to dust. I hold on to them because I was too weak to save them. I carry the fault of their deaths. I failed. I'm worthless. My name means nothing if I cannot protect. My own sisters were torn from me in front of my eyes, souls ripped of all they were and the innocent life draining from their eyes, and I couldn't save them. Even you are just a ghost in the future haunting Rukia and tearing apart my being. You were dead before I was born." Kion was stunned speechless by the catastrophe of words spilling from Ichigo's lips, the figure alone and still where usually he would pace or run his hands through his hair. Instead he swayed lifelessly on his feet, his voice loud and thundering, still escaping through the forest and ringing in Kion's ears. The water was drowning Kion's thoughts, and it seemed to fill his head as the words slowly connected with Nejibana's quiet intervention. Ichigo was from the future. He didn't doubt his brother's words. Ichigo, however delusional, couldn't make something this tremulous up. It solved so many of the mysteries that had collapsed around the youth as they lived together. Even that first night drowned in rain, Ichigo was right, it was always the rain, when Ichigo had appeared out of charged air with a well of power that brought Soul Society to its knees. It explained so much, the endless mysteries of his past, people who they had never heard of, wars that had been fought that they had never seen, the wisdom and trepidation when he met certain characters. But Kion wondered how it was even possible, and what had been so deeply horrifying to force Ichigo to live each day with the presences of the dead cloying and clamoring around him. If Kion considered Ichigo's character, he could see the reason. Ichigo was a protector, one who would sacrifice everything for family, and to have the world sacrifice itself for him would surely crush his soul. But Ichigo had spoken of betrayal, and how could that be with who he was? Eyes drifting to Ichigo, the pale form standing desolate, head cast towards the ground, Kion pushed aside desperate musings and gathering silence for another time and raced forward so that he was holding Ichigo in a half-hug, leaving distance so that Kion could glimpse Ichigo's soul-killing eyes. It welled up inside him a desperate need to convince his brother of how wrong he was. The water droplets around them suspended themselves sluggishly, drifting around their forms and collecting in rivulets by Kion's feet. "So, what, I died? They died over and over again, but you chose to come back. You have lived with it for so long, seen their faces every day. Ichigo, you've strived for so much and I know nothing, but already you've accomplished more than any could be said. They wouldn't want you to suffer, just as your Zanpakuto, a part of your soul, speaks. They too would want you to move on without hesitation. Never forget them as they forged who you are, but accept that they are gone and it wasn't your fault. Sometimes life doesn't allow us to be what we think we need to be, sometimes she's a cruel bitch. But Ichigo, you lived because of them. It's up to you whether you want to throw it away. The future is likely safe now. I know you've had a hand in the Vizard incident. Look what you accomplished. If it wasn't for you, they would have been banished, or if Central 46 had their way executed. You saved them already. You are changing a future that was yours. This world will be different no matter what. Let go of this pain inside your heart. Ichigo looked up, eyes starting to flicker in an unchained hope even as they rumbled with emptiness in the dawning quiet. He responded, I want to, damn it. Kyan, I want it to be over. I'm so damn tired of it all. This planning, this pain, my soul erupts and spews torment and tempestuous storms upon me over and over. And if it being over means healing, I want that. I've saved so much, even turned the madman away from hell-bent destruction. But there's so much more in front of me, a seemingly endless road. Goddamn, I'm so sick and tired of hiding behind facades, endless questions, and I don't know what to do. I want to talk to someone, tell them everything about Orium's smile, Rukia's drawings, Chad's coin, so that they live on beyond me. I want to share their last moments and feel that soul-crushing pain settle, if only slightly. Wounds that have only scabbed to become scars, a reminder but not a gaping part of me. There was another man who traveled through time. But I'm alone. I arrived in a crash of light, a stranger in the world I knew that didn't know me. And I'm so fucking afraid it will happen again. That I will cradle your broken corpses knowing I was useless to stop it. So damn scared that you'll all turn to find me useless, lock me in Mugen again, charge me with betrayal and hate me. My secrets, they're too much. Swallowing me whole. I've shared with Yamji, talked to the old man, told him the truth, but he can't aid me. It's not enough. They're like piercing knives, an endless tattoo never stopping, always there, and I'm so lost. Kyan. Thank you so much for trying, you all helped, but there's too much and it's rushing, overpowering, so much so that my own soul cannot defend me from this darkness. I want to heal, and see their smiles once again, watch you grow old and take an apprentice. I want to see a future, I want to live. Ichigo's words were rushed from his mouth fast and heartbreaking, so full of despair and sorrow, equated by hope and light in an uneven and dizzying mixture that left Kyan feeling tears streaming down his cheeks, and Nijibana echoed his grief, her piercing wails for their kin echoing in his inner world. There was also light, a hope welling in his chest and sliding along his Reisu, because damn it, Ichigo wanted to live, and that was all Kyan needed. Before he could contemplate his actions, he pulled Ichigo into a tight hug, surrounding him with his form and warmth. Reisu, a powerful force coiling around Ichigo, embracing and swelling the forlorn child in his arms. Ichigo, you are not alone, we are with you. You don't have to bear this burden alone, we will take it with you, all of us. We love you and won't ever turn our back on you. The past, yours and mine, has been, what matters is our future. We will stop whatever destruction and horrors from happening. You won't have to hold our broken bodies, we are there for you. Kyan's words were slow and moving, caressing and soft over the endless pour of rain. Thunder rumbled and crackled sharp with the flash of light illuminating the land, and Ichigo looked up from where his head had been resting in the crook of Kyan's neck. Those orange locks were plastered to his face, eyes a dizzying tilt of emotions so prevalent in a miasma that had Kyan choking. I was never alone, just too strong to bear it. But I'll live because the loneliness is not quite so wide. That lone sentence, a complex simplicity of overwhelming meaning, swirled like a prophecy in the air, words of a man living for the future. Before Kyan could respond, Ichigo looked into his eyes and whispered, Please Kyan, end it, I want the suffering to be over, help me heal in the light of day. Don't let me fall into darkness. Then Ichigo tipped forward, boneless eyes fluttering cold. Kyan caught his body hands reaching up to trace the pulse of his neck. He was horrified to feel it fluttery and faint, the beating of his heart echoing the ending of a clock. He slung Ichigo in his arms, the rain impairing his vision for a moment before it parted like a sea-swept storm under the force of their Reisu as he charged forward, trusting the guiding flow of Nijibana towards the 4th Division. X. Chapter 29, Amaranthin. X. Everything was a soft white, it surrounded him like a familiar blanket, cradling him in faint sensations of warmth and peace. Ichigo wanted to bask in the feelings. The peace that had abandoned his life and appeared in flashes ever since the war, now swathed him like a mother's embrace, warm with every sense of home. Thoughts of the chaos and war filtered through his head slowly before simmering to nothingness, as if the terror of his own thoughts couldn't reach him in this surreal plane of white. Ichigo opened his eyes, or at least that was the feeling he associated it with as his sight gazed at the world of ivory. It was like a winter-swept land after the storm settled, leaving everything soft and pure looking, covering his view, spanning endlessly beyond sight. The place and all its emptiness, while slightly unsettling, was overwhelmed by the blank quiet and peace that Ichigo struggled to find even in his inner world. When the inevitability of his memories and soul would rise up with leveling waters, murky currents that caressed his form in malignance and sorrow like a lost lover. Thinking of his inner world weighted Ichigo's mind with thoughts of his Zanpakuto. Where were they? That one question brought forth a flood of questions surging through his mind and brimming on his lips, begging to be asked. It came back in pieces like dust on the wind gathered up from the four corners of the earth, and in no chronological order. There was a clarity in his mind that had been lost since he had returned to Soul Society after the Vizard training, perhaps longer than that. It was as if cloudy glass panes, weathered from years under Mother Nature's whims, had finally been swept clear. Ichigo's emotions felt raw and stark, but they weren't like the flood waters rising in the monsoon season. They were just there, a part of him that he could better accept. That grief still swirled, endlessly lapping at the edges of his senses as it always had, always would. But it was lighter? As if he pictured sorrow and mourning as the night darker than the latest hour, yet it had lightened to a gray. That's where it would stay, because he could heal, and was healing, yet it always left a mark, left traces. Turning his mind to the broken assembly of thoughts and memories, he could see now how foolish he had been in refusing to confide in one of his friends sooner. At least he had a whisper of sense to try and speak, but by then it was too late for much of anything. Ichigo had torn himself from his spirits, blocked their words from his mind. He had hurt them so bad with that gesture, and he knew it. It pounded in time with the fluttery beat of his heart, and dragged awfully at his insides. Ichigo had broken their promise, locked them away, closed his senses to their voices, was blind to their Reisu, when he swore he would never do such again. The thought pounded in his head, accompanied by his heart, and the breath in his lungs was choked out for a long while, before he focused his thoughts, the deep-seated pain in his heart telling him this would haunt Ichigo for a long while. Ichigo's bond with Zanjitsu was essential to their soul. Without them Ichigo would have broken down multiple times over, would have lost what shreds of sanity remained, and left the world caked in some wicked chaos. They were his anchor, his support, the world to him when all else had fallen. The two spirits understood him better than even Ichigo understood himself, and yet they still cared for their brash, sometimes idiotic wielder. They had saved him when it all became too much, when he was standing on the edge of a dangerous precipice, when he couldn't muster the will or strength to raise his blade. They pulled him together till he was standing upright. When his powers had been taken after Aizen and the Winter War, Ichigo had spiraled far, drifting away from friends and family as if his voice couldn't reach them through the waves. He sunk beneath their own imposing walls. Some whisper of Zanjitsu in the lingering traces of his badge, and even more so in his own hands and eyes, had held him together long enough for their reunion. Ichigo smiled softly at the thought of that reunion, the bliss of his powers surging through his body, alighting every nerve and playing wickedly with his inner world. They all had basked in the sensations of togetherness, and even then, in a time where he hadn't known the truth, Ichigo had easily pulled Shiro to his side, the hole in his soul not only fitting Zanjitsu Asen, before the righteous fury came. They had cursed the names of his friends and family for leaving Ichigo in such a state. Ichigo at the time hadn't known what the spirits meant. He thought he could understand better now, Reisu raving around like a wild dog. But then they had seen Ichigo's acceptance, the will of his soul unchanging in the face of such trials, and they had been proud. Zanjitsu Asen had smiled that deep grin, the one that chased away the night, and Shiro, well, he had well and truly cackled. Thinking of his spirits carved softly into his heart and rustled along the sensations of Reisu in this surreal plane. He tilted his head in confusion, considering his Reisu and the keen difference he could lightly identify. For a split second it reminded him of the rain. Then his mind drifted to that night and the grand specter that had appeared like some ominous reaper. The realization that he had released such a plethora of power to take down the Minos Grande, really, tired Ichigo. A fully charged in seal mode Getsuga Tensho was overkill, and consequently likely revealing how much he had been hiding his powers shocked him and had him clenching his hands, or what served as his form on this plane, into a fist. He had been so damn careless. He could have screwed everything up for everyone, could have alerted Bach to his presence early, and that could have proven to be catastrophic. Kion flashed in his mind's eyes, determined, with tears steaming down his cheeks as he countered Ichigo's despair with the bright pulsing light of his soul. He had told Kion the truth. The thought caught his breath. He wondered if his brother even believed Ichigo, or if he thought Ichigo had finally fallen over the edge, because as much as Kion trusted Ichigo, anyone would think him crazy for shouting to the world that he had seen that same world fall to dust. Kion had looked him in the eyes, fought every breath of Ichigo's will with his own, and his soul had believed Ichigo's desperate words. Kami that had been stunning, because it was easy to tell an old man who was wise and could easily garner the meaning of Ichigo's words, or coyly tease certain scientist into believing that he was toying a balance. But when it was a babble of words pouring from his heart straight to his mouth, and family, the fear of betrayal, abandonment, the end of something was so heavy and weightless at the same time. It swallowed a person whole if they dwelled only on the fear and dark alternatives, but Ichigo was already half submerged. Kaien's honest Reisu, accompanied by Nejibana's presence imbued in the very rain around them surging through the water, convinced Ichigo otherwise if only temporarily. Convinced the youth that the water wasn't going to choke life from the creatures in its grasp, not when Kaien was there and Nejibana's swaying lily presence flourished in such an element. Then he had begged Kaien to save him, from himself, from the rain, from it all, before the encroaching darkness and cold had finally swallowed him. He had fought it for so long, but in Kaien's arms, with those sea-stone eyes staring into his own with love, Ichigo knew he was safe and had finally succumbed to the pounding in his chest and the heavy weight of his weariness. Then there was nothing but white. While Siriti was a city forged of white stone, this was not Soul Society or any form of the fourth with the soft hum of healing Reisu, and Anohana's striking presence that was like chai or cinnamon, sweet but with a bite. No, this was endless white blanketing him in feelings of warmth and home, soothing all his worries and fears till he felt he could just stay and rest for an eternity of time, only the curiosity and faint impressions of some outside force shimmering the time-still sense of the place. Wisps of ebony swirled in the distance like sand flicking up in spirals that danced with grace, like the flight of the Jigo Kuko. It coalesced pulling together into a small form that was achingly familiar and so inherently painful that Ichigo's breath caught in his throat, and he felt his heart had stopped. Her form seemed to glide towards him light as air, and with all the ghostly presence of the living, there was a flush on her cheeks, light in her eyes, and the blood that had stained the world like a canvas of crimson was nowhere to be found. That petite smile was on her lips, the once that was fond and true, the one that sometimes lingered when she stared at her brother, or after Ichigo did something particularly endearing, stupid. Ichigo's hand reached out, of its own accord drawn towards the figure who was an arm's reach away, his eyes hungrily drunk in her visage. This was different than the pale specters that had haunted his nights and days in the week leading up to his collapse. It had stuck his heart like a gong to see their figures, stone-cold and pale as morning lilies, sometimes immortalized as they had been in death crimson painting everything in sickly shades of night, other times they were hollow, a product of the endless despair that had carved them out as family and friends fell around them. She looked like the day he had first met her, when she had floated through his window on winds of fate and manipulation. When they had spat and she taught him, then the fight with the hollow where she sacrificed herself so that Ichigo could save his family. The crown of her hair glimmered like raven feathers, and fathomless indigo eyes stared into Ichigo's own amber orbs drenched in a spiral of emotions. Rukia? Ichigo questioned, voice seeming loud and quiet all at once in this empty space of nothingness. White. She tilted her head then, as if adjusting to his voice, her eyes sweeping over Ichigo in that fond adoration before she nodded. The moment held like time suspended by the maw of a celestial being. Tenderly Ichigo's hand reached up and rested on her cheek, taking in her young vibrant eyes, the form of her spirit, and the warmth of her skin with a soft longing and pained smile. Rukia's hand stretched out to rest on Ichigo's own cheek before it reached up, pushing aside long bangs, running through hair tickling the bridge of his neck, tracing his defined jaw. He had changed since they all had last seen him. More so since this version of Rukia had seen him, this new lieutenant of Soul Society who had only recently passed the grief of the loss of her mentor, and had found happiness again even in the soft in-between spaces of war. Ichigo had grown from that unruly teenager, who rushed head first, blade swinging, Reisu surging wild and unkept, into a man during the course of the war. A child grown too fast, settling into his skin with a fervent speed and need. He had never truly felt comfortable with what he was, not with the sudden revelations thrown at him every which way and the lengths he strived and forced himself to become stronger, but it had been pushed aside as he never settled, always moving on to the next battle. Now he was a little bit older, still a fair bit twisted, a little bit wiser, and mostly settled into who he was. As if sensing his thoughts and their drowning complexity, Rukia's demeanor tensed and changed so that she was staring at Ichigo with that sharp disappointment and scolding that she always adapted when she decided it was time to scold some sense into the orange-haired Shinigami. Ichigo. How could you be such an idiot? Baka. Rukia started softly, before she stepped back, fist raised and the image of an angered sprite enlivened. There it was. Ichigo acknowledged with fond smile, the inevitable snap. Ichigo could only tense in preparation for the words that would be so sharp, and truthful, and stinging but right. How could you let yourself fall to such a state? Orium always tried to feed you for a reason. Do you think Yuka Teiko forced you to go out with him just for tea? Kami, I swear they need to instate the Look After Ichigo Club 2.0 with how well you can take care of yourself. And honestly? What were you thinking when you decided not to talk to anyone? I get you're reclusive as all fuck, but you have people to talk to. Just because Nii-sama's busy doesn't mean he wouldn't take the time to talk even if he was with Hisuna, or Kyan-san for Kami's sake. You know he cares about family more than enough to drop work on a breath's insistence. Rukia raved, small form enshrouded in Reisu as she bashed Ichigo over the head a few times to get her point across. Ichigo nodded sagely, already well aware of her points and his own stupidity. Rukia stared for a minute before a sardonic laugh slipped out, and in a less accusing tone she said, "You're such a baka, Ichigo. You're still wondering how you traveled through time?" Rukia questioned easily, and Ichigo looked up confused before he nodded slowly and slightly hesitantly. Rukia shook her head and continued, "Still can't see what's in front of you, yet able to plan for an alternative no one could or would think plausible. You did it, it was you who traveled through time. It wasn't the Hogyaka or some will of the Soul King, it was your own power and will. Kami, I know you can be an idiot sometimes, Ichi, but you need to open your eyes and stop trying to be humble or stop with the denial. I swear, how did you even survive so long? You are more powerful than the Soul King of our time. You sealed away your powers because they were crazy expansive, but you couldn't even get a read on how vast they are. Baka, you should take the time to know your powers." Ichigo stared wide-eyed, mind uncomprehending as he tried to process Rukia's words. They made sense on a distant level, as if the truth had always been on the tip of his tongue, but he had never bothered to swallow it, and that was just crazy. Sometimes he felt it, when he really opened his eyes, the ones of his inner soul, and glimpsed the souls of others, touched the void of space, felt the might of the world wrapped into the threads of life. Rukia laughed and knocked Ichigo upside the head once more in her typical violent manner. Eyes radiant, she smiled and waited for Ichigo to respond. The young Shinigami's gaze drifted around the endless white emblazoned around him as he slowly nestled the idea within his soul, accepting it for what it was. It was just another part of him, like everything else. Like the Quincy heritage, like the blood of the Shinigami's history, like his own faults. If he could accept those, then it wasn't too far of a stretch to accept that he had trans-dimensional powers? Sixth dimension level powers? He had never bothered to keep track of the deity stuff Aizen had been sprouting in many of his monologues. In that moment, his soul finally settled that fraction more. There was always room to grow, but he felt he finally understood his own soul a bit more. And Kami, wasn't he an idiot if he hadn't seen this staring him in the face the whole time? Of course, as always Rukia was right. Speaking of the ebony-crowned little devil, Ichigo turned his gaze and curiosity to her. "Where am I, midget?" Ichigo asked with a smirk, easily slipping back into their old roles, the bickering like an old married couple, the teasing and fun like they were siblings. At one point Ichigo had hooked up with Rukia. Renji had sulked for days on end. It had been good, had worked so well, but then it didn't. They preferred to be friends, that's how it was. She was like a sister to him, granted a little sister who was not exactly younger. She scowled, turning sharp eyes on Ichigo, eager to jump in the fray and teasing under the pseudo-animosity. Like a feral animal she smiled and responded, "Don't know, strawberry, just what you whipped up, some other plane, maybe a dream." Ichigo scowled at the old moniker even as a fondness bubbled up in his chest like a spring of warmth. Rukia shrugged at her own non-committal answer. Leaving Ichigo truly wondering where they were. There was none of the blurriness and distortion he associated with a dream, yet the plane had no sense. He pushed his curiosity aside, happy to enjoy the moment with his friend. Rukia grinned faintly before a familiar scowl settled on her lips. "Don't think I'm finished chewing you out yet, Ichigo," she warned with a shake of her finger, righteous fury flooding crystal irises. Ichigo nodded, basking in her presence once more. Damn, he missed them all, and even her nagging and yelling was welcome in the face of his loss. "There you go again, always dwelling on our deaths, Ichigo. Come on, Baka, we're free now, you've already saved us. I mean seriously, only an idiot like you could think of even trying to convince Aizen that he shouldn't destroy the world. And don't get me started on the pining. Kami, it's almost ridiculous watching you fumble and ignore your feelings." I mean seriously Ichigo, you hooked up with him in the last life. Granted that did take drastic measures, and it was more of a fling because in war you try not to get that connected. But that's beside the point. I swear blatantly ignoring your feelings, do I have to smack sense into you again, strawberry head? Ichigo processed Rukia's gaggle of words in a rather slow manner. The comforting and blank aura of the place seemed to drain any need for haste. So Ichigo took his time eyeing the midget and slipping over the words in his mind. Rukia's nagging made sense as usual, at least for the first bit, which is what he would try to focus/analyze because he really didn't want to deal with the headache of emotions romance brought forth. Rukia in her nagging was correct as always, and really Ichigo accepted that he was an idiot. Maybe it was who he was, brash and reckless, or some remnants of his teenage years, but Ichigo was definitely too far gone to care that he had tried, and succeeded, to save Aizosuke. Ichigo guessed if he thought about it he had saved them? No, not really, he acknowledged within his mind. That was far too optimistic for any crazy person to consider, Ichigo remarked to himself with a slight curve to his lips of amusement. Still he knew that when they had passed in his timeline, they had been freed from the torment and constant torture of a world burning up in war. Granted, some souls had been lost forever under the weight of a Quincy attack, others had entered the cycle of rebirth only to succumb to a crumbling world. Those thoughts were mean, true enough to hurt, but also a gentle reminder that they hadn't seen the end, or lived through a sick twist. Rukia's gaze sharpened, and like she always did somehow no, like any who had always known him were always able to tell when he was avoiding a subject. Her eyes alone conveyed her demand for Ichigo to stop procrastinating and focus on the topics he was avoiding. Running her words once more, he paused, flying over one phrase on repeat, brow furrowed in thought and eyes bright. Ichigo pursed his lips for a moment before looking up, catching the raven locks of Rukia's hair framing her petite features and shading sharp crystalline orbs from sight. You said you all were watching over me? Is that true? Ichigo questioned softly, thoughts and warmth bubbling throughout him. Rukia's demeanor softened as well, eyes sincere and gentle. She smiled and nodded before answering, of course we're watching over you, Baka. Couldn't leave an idiotic strawberry on his own. Don't try to deny it, your own collapse is proof enough. Ichigo scowled at her teasing and reprimanding, but the familiar expression he usually adopted slid away to be replaced with one of those faint smiles full of good humor and warmth. That expression was held for all of a minute, or what felt like such a time, in a room with nothing indicating anything, before his brow once more furrowed in thought, and curiosity lightened his yes. How are you watching over me? Rukia shook her head regarding Ichigo cynically. For a second Ichigo worried that Rukia would pull out her sketchbook and illustrate the answer, which would become less of an answer and more a piece of modern work. Rukia's eyes narrowed as if sensing Ichigo's thoughts, which was completely likely with how perceptive the midget could be, and how long they had known each other, before she tilted her head as if thinking and responded, it's difficult to explain. I think Kisuke would be one of the few people to understand it decently enough to explain all the science portions of the equations. But I think it simmers down to, you build a bond with people, share love, Reisu, touch souls, and that lingers on. So, while our timeline is gone and our souls aren't really a thing in the whole space-time continuum, matter, our energy, the thoughts, and love we shared for and with you is still there, and so we're watching over you even if we're mostly powerless, we're here for you. Ichigo sat down at her answer because he hadn't necessarily been expecting that. The truth that they had been watching over him was shocking enough. The idea that their bond was the reason for their presence warmed his chest and left that smile, the ones of his childhood, open and free, littering his lips and stretching the muscles of his face. They were watching over him. Somehow the confirmation was powerful, endearing, and comforting. Ichigo basked in the cozy sensations for a little while, just simmering with it all, digesting what this experience had brought him. Rukia led him, plopping down beside him with her usual grace and airs. Her cool presence and the sensation of Reisu wrapped around him. It carried with it the gentle scent of jasmine and freshly fallen snow that he had deeply come to associate with Rukia. She turned then as if sensing Ichigo's straying thoughts and pinned him into place with sharp ice-cut eyes. Ichigo knew he couldn't run from it, not when faced with a diviner of truth such as Rukia. The orange-haired time traveler sighed, running a hand through his hair in a familiar tic, sight straying to gaze at the vast plains of endless expanding white before he sighed a small sigh again and said, "It's not the same. This isn't a war, and he already has someone. She'll make him happy. Me, I can barely handle my relationships right now, and what if he wants someone who isn't Ace, someone who wants deeper intimacy? Rukia turned understanding eyes his way, her soul brought forth a minuscule smile upon Ichigo's lips even as dark thoughts laced his brow and brewed in his chest like an oncoming storm. He couldn't deal with sexual contact, didn't want it or like it, not anymore. Ichigo was fine with that, he had accepted who he was long before the revelation of his newfound sexuality. But Byakuya, he deserved someone, the relationship he had with Hisuna, he deserved the intimacy that Ichigo would never be able to provide. Byakuya needed a partner, not someone whose weekly schedule involved a mental breakdown, or nights swallowed in haunting dreams. Oh, Ichigo was going to start trying to heal. Once he woke up he wouldn't push it away anymore. Kyan had finally helped Ichigo to accept that he needed to try, that he couldn't hold on to their memories in such a painful way. The breakdown has just been another factor in a long simmering solution. Ichigo wouldn't push whatever feelings he was developing onto the Kukaki heir, because Ichigo probably wasn't ready, and he doubted the both of them had really come to term with their feelings, if Byakuya even had any, and he wasn't going to ruin Byakuya's life with his own selfish whims. Rukia scowled before hitting him upside the head, hoping to knock some sense into Ichigo likely. The only result of her action was the hissing and clutching of his skull, followed by a faintly vicious glare in Rukia's direction. The ebony-haired midget laughed, swatting away Ichigo's light fist on a path of revenge before she really stared at Ichigo. I swear Ichigo, you're hopeless when it comes to romance. I mean, you have learned a little but you still have a long way to go. Just because Byakuya loves Hisuna doesn't mean he can't love you too, and besides I think you know the cause of her illness. Rukia paused, eyes sad and dark in that awful way Ichigo hated to see in any of his friends. As if sensing Rukia's distress or Ichigo's own frothing emotions, another presence appeared behind Ichigo. Stalked against his back was a broad and familiar form. One that smelt of hot cocoa and the heavy tang of metal. Ichigo would recognize Chad's presence anywhere lest the feel of his Reisu, which was like liquid gold and crimson. Rukia blinked slightly, eyes darting from Chad to Ichigo for a moment before she shook her head in amusement, watching as Ichigo tilted his head back to look up into Chad's one revealed eye. The orange head could see that familiar promise in those eyes, years of silent communication passing between their eyes in an instant, one that spoke of reassurance and comfort. A wide smile curled Ichigo's lips and he settled back against the familiar presence, breathing in the feeling of his friends. A beaconing smile slipped onto Rukia's lips, followed by an easy smile on Chad's own face. Rukia quirked her eyebrows before she continued, you know the cause of her illness, and that there's not viable cure. But Ichigo, you've already changed the timeline. I know you're worried about what will happen to Byakuya when she passes, but you'll be there for him. It doesn't have to be like it was in the war. He isn't the Byakuya you know, and you're a different Ichigo in the end. And because you're Ichigo and whatever you do in life is usually 5 galaxies from normal, your relationship doesn't have to fit normal standards. Chad assented to Rukia's wisdom with a small grunt, and the flowing brush of Reisu, like the hot southern winds sweeping across desert lands, brushed across his skin. Ichigo thought over her words. Really, he was almost lost without his Zanpakuto spirit's wisdom and guidance, but Ichigo was sort of functioning as he considered Rukia's words. She was right and he mostly knew it. She was almost always right. Maybe it was a women thing, but it was still a hard thing to grasp. Relationships during a war didn't really work. That hadn't stopped Ichigo from falling in love with everyone a few times over, but Ichigo had learned his lesson. It was hard to lose a friend, but devastating to lose a love. So, he stuck to one-night stands, and poured the love he felt for them into his battles, into his will to survive and protect. He wasn't in a war anymore. That didn't mean he was ready for serious relationships. It was near impossible to think of when you know a person so well you can breathe all their deepest secrets in one breath. Byakuya, however, was different in a slight way. Maybe it was because of Ichigo, but he was open, the same Byakuya Ichigo knew, and yet completely different. Chad nudged Ichigo's shoulder with one of those smiles on his face, and Ichigo nodded, getting the message. As long as he acknowledged it and considered the possibility, and stopped trying to run away from his feelings, they could leave the topic alone. Rukia huffed, sending Ichigo a bemused look as if chiding him. She said, I swear you would be lost without us. MMHM proofs already there? Ichigo replied with a light tone and a wink. Rukia scowled and Chad frowned slightly at their friend's easy acceptance, but Ichigo shrugged. It was what it was. 2 new presences flickered on the edges of Ichigo's senses and he tilted his head up only to hear a familiar call. "Oi Ichigo! You idiot!" Urayu appeared behind Orium, where the brunette was dragging the gangly Quincy behind her with a determined aura and the soft-willed look only she could muster. Urayu was as per usual scowling, the light bouncing off the lenses of his glasses and catching on the Quincy embodiments emblazoned on his outfit. Orium was dressed in a comfy outfit that suited her ditzy personality. A beaming smile stretched across her face and her eyes were bright as supernovas. Urayu was tossed to the ground in what should have been a gentle move from Orium, but Tatsuki's training had adverse effects that no one had realized till it was too late, and Orium was accidentally body-flipping people left and right. Thinking of Tatsuki, brought to mind the others Kigo, and Asano even, Chizuru, he missed them. When the Winter War began they had done everything in their power to keep their other friends out of the battle. Those who had invaded Soul Society were already far too immersed. They had become a safe haven of sorts, having enough power to temporarily defend themselves. Ichigo and the others could meet them for coffee, just talk normally. They had continued to support them as life went on and the tides of war became darker and their friends more haggard and despairing. Thinking of them and their cruel endings twisted Ichigo's gut and darkened his eyes. A large warm hand jolted Ichigo from his thoughts as it settled on his shoulder, and Ichigo looked up to see Chad's knowing gaze. A flutter of Reisu whisper soft danced across his skin and Ichigo nodded, a reassuring light in his eyes as Orium dropped to the ground beside Urayu. Urayu and Orium, in an awkward shuffle that involved the whole group, eventually settled so that Orium was squished beside Ichigo, and Urayu was wedged into the small space between Chad and Orium. It was messy but it worked, and reminded Ichigo of days where at the dawn of morning after nights of battle they would collapse in the barracks in a dog pile of limbs and Reisu. So their souls together till they couldn't tell one's thoughts from another's feelings. Ichigo basked in their presences, absorbed the feeling of togetherness that had been gone for so long, a feeling he doubted he would ever find again. Orium giggled beside Ichigo and he turned, considering the young women she had become. Over the war they had all changed, grown up from adolescents rushing in head first, to powerful adults. Orium had driven her powers to new lengths to stand on the battlefield, mastered ways to rip a person inside out by rejecting a certain vein or organ, could just as easily reject healing as to apply it. She had kept up her bubbly persona, but it had become tame and mature, still ever whimsical, but when she snapped she was as terrifying as Anohana and could be far deadlier. Urayu was still scowling, sizing Ichigo up under the mask of his specter's eyes, fond and irritated in a mix only Urayu had mastered. Ichigo felt the familiar pull to argue with his cousin, about whatever inane topic rise in his chest just for old time's sake. Their bond by blood was one of cousins, but Ichigo considered them brothers any day. Even when Urayu had falsified a betrayal Ichigo had already known it was fake, because Urayu was a good actor, but when you've spent years upon desert sand sharing a small tent you know everything. You are such an idiot, Kurosaki, or should I say Shiba now. Urayu began with a slight bite and Ichigo laughed, eyes bright as he began to rise to the challenge. Orium's tinkling laughter trickled between them, even as Rukia sighed and in a resigned tone said, I already nagged him for everything. Urayu huffed and looked Ichigo in the eyes and said, I doubt the idiot listened to any of it though. Ichigo scowled and responded, and how would you know with your pride clogging your senses? They stared down each other for a tense moment, Ichigo daring Urayu to leap forward so they could tumble across the stretches of endless white. Finally, Urayu broke and looked away with a small laugh, eyes brightening and losing the serious tint as he turned to face Ichigo once more and said, You never change. Ichigo wanted to deny Urayu's fond words, but he knew it was still mostly true, so he let it slide. If Ichigo had any semblance of a plan in responding, it was interrupted as his cheek was pinched between two stern fingers. Ichigo turned his head a slight bit to see a pout firmly entrenched on Orium's features. The time traveler grimaced. He did not like seeing that expression on her features, least what it boded for him. Dummy. How come you are not eating enough? Was my food so bad that you can't stomach real-world food? Orium scolded softly, eyes sharp as needles, as she interrogated the poor Shinigami castrated against Chad in the face of her wrath. At the end, her lips twitched slightly, indicating that she was mostly joking about the last remark. It was a bit of an inside joke between their group. No one had expected anything edible of the food combinations she whipped up, and no one had been brave enough to try them. But then there was a mission, and while Ichigo could cook fine, and Chad could manage, they had all been dead tired. So, When Orium came out of the makeshift kitchen carrying something light purple and smoking, there had been a few uneasy glances and bets who would see the morning. It had been good in a weird sort of way, like a comfort food or a family tradition that was a part of some special event. Oh, the texture had been weird, but the flavors had blended well enough. Orium had practically lit up the endless night with her enthusiasm when she found they liked her food, though they were still slightly opposed to eating it again, and wondering over the health benefits or lack thereof. I'm sorry. Geez, how many times does a guy have to apologize for starving himself? Nahime, your food was just so good that everything tastes bland in comparison. Ichigo half whined, half apologized, sincerely joking in an attempt to lighten the mood, and draw away indubitably from more pestering from his friends on his eating habits. Orium laughed, different from the fake giggles she enticed the rest of the world with. Her laughter was deep and whole. What Ichigo said was partially true. He really did miss Orium's stunning food combinations. They were like a taste of home. Kyan had been super freaked out the one time he caught Ichigo enjoying rice with jam in a strike of homesickness. The elder Shiba had been stunned speechless, pointing between the food and Ichigo, half attempting to speak, as his mind computed another boggling Ichigo thing. Or at least that was what Ichigo supposed Kyan was doing whenever he was silenced by one mood or the other of Ichigo's. Rukia chuckled softly at Ichigo's answer, while Urayu huffed a faint smile belaying his actions. Chad trapped one of Ichigo's moving hands beneath his own much larger palm. Ichigo looked up and caught the intent of Chad's eyes, the gentle smile playing on the giant's lips, and Ichigo nodded, answering the unspoken question. He would be fine in the end, even though he had lost everything of his old world except for his soul kin. He had made new family and friends and familiar strangers. There was warmth pulsing in his chest when he thought of Kyan and the Shiba clan, their endless concern for him and the boundless love they shared. Byakuya, who had embraced everything Ichigo had thrown at them with a beckoning smile. The Vizard, who had become a family again under Ichigo and Sosuke's power, one with a stronger bond and the will to push towards the future. His captain and Jushiro, the Suteiko, Anohana, the list went on as he considered them all. Ichigo settled into the balance he had carved out for himself. He would worry about the future, and the no doubt angered presences of his friends when he woke up. For now, he settled into the closely knit group, breathing in the familiar sense of home, the gentle lilt of Reisu like a lullaby, and the comfort of it all. Remember that time Urayu and Orium raided the Espada camp? Rukia questioned softly, lightly striking conversation. She received a multitude of nods and laughter as they thought of the story. Orium brightened while Urayu groaned, dragging a palm across his features as if he could rid himself of the memories. Oh yeah, and Chad and Ichi came busting in to save us because they thought we had been kidnapped, when in reality we were drinking tea. Orium chirped excitedly, clapping her hands together. Ichigo laughed under his breath, eyes fond as he recalled that scene to mind. It certainly had been one of the stranger moments in the war, but also completely unsurprising in the way that their lives often were. Urayu groaned then and continued where Orium had left off. Yes, while Orium wanted to drink tea with them, I had been dragged into the whole matter. Not to mention their guard kept eyeing me up as if I was a piece of meat. Rukia placatingly patted Urayu on the head with a sardonic smile that belied her true intentions. Urayu only sighed and swatted at her hand, casting a glare in Ichigo's direction, partially because he could, and likely because he was Urayu and always willing to antagonize. And then I arrive only to find you all dressed up as if you were in some desert oasis in the human world. Rukia replied with a laugh, bringing a small smile out onto Ichigo's lips. Looking up, he could see a small smile on Chad's lips as well, the amusement in his eyes radiating like the sun. Ichigo did remember that the outfits and the whole scenario had seemed like some weird dream. Ichigo rested amongst his friends, the people he called family, soaking in their presence and basking in the nostalgia and warmth. They continued to reminisce in airy voices that rushed over Ichigo and lightened his own spirit, drawing away some of the weight he could hardly feel in this limitless plane but knew nonetheless was there. He savored the time, knowing when he woke that it would all be gone. Ichigo had come to a few realizations while submerged in this depthless plane, but that didn't diminish the truth any less, and the truth was that he wouldn't be able to speak with his friends like this in the waking world ever again. Not these friends who had shared the stories with him, gotten tied up in all manner of situations. And that was okay, because just the same he had newer memories, ones created with those of this timeline, experiences, and his own fair share of troubles. One day, like he had promised Rukia, and so many others, he would speak of them plainly, tell of story after story till his throat ran dry and his eyes were like pools of limitless water. Ichigo would make sure the memory of their sacrifices and the lives they had lived would thrive on not only in him but within his friends. Remember when Ikaika recruited half of Soul Society into doing his lucky dance? Laughter rippled among the group at Uriu's tone. Ichigo joined in, lungs light in his chest and eyes bright as a hearth. This was home and it would always be so, time couldn't take that away. Rukia continued the story detailing the disastrous events that followed the incident. Ichigo sighed contently and closed his eyes happy and free. X. Chapter 30, Suff. X. The fourth was a mess, or at least part of it was, one room sectioned in the back far away from the rest of the division. Anohana stared in equal parts despair and annoyance at the boarded-off room where one of her patients lay. Reisu surged around the room in a whirling vortex that snapped and ripped at any who dared to come close in a heavy defensive manner. Anohana had been able to breach the area only a sparse few times, and when she did it felt as if one was wading through thick syrup and that the air was as thin as the peak of a mountain. Turning her gaze around, her eyes searched for the one other member of the fourth who had surprisingly been able to enter the room without concern. Hanataro wasn't the best Shinigami by any means, he wasn't overly powerful or intelligent, but Anohana respected his determination and spirit. Not to mention his own Zanpakuto was one suited to the art of healing. It had been a strange change of events that when the young Shinigami was sent to check on the patient, as best as one could from behind a doorway, after drawing lots, Ichigo's Reisu had calmed like still waters, allowing Hanataro to enter. Hanataro had veritably freaked out, but had entered the room anyway, heedless of his own trepidation, and checked on the patient before reporting to Retsu. She had rushed to the scene eager to reassess on the patient. While Hanataro had deserted the patient to report the news, Ichigo's Reisu had picked up once more in that frightening lash of power that tore the surrounding area to shreds, but was kept temporarily at bay only by powerful Kido Haki and Tessai had created. The same power that had rippled out over Soul Society and had stolen the breath of most Shinigami, brining them to their knees, before dying to nothing. Over an hour later, Kion had appeared with the reason held tightly in his arms, a hypothermic orange head. As soon as Hanataro reappeared, the rampant Reisu settled. It paused as it sensed Anohana, but unlike before it seemed to almost shrug and let her pass. It had been a relief to check up on her patient once again after that first night. Kion had appeared like a herald of the storm, drenched head to toe yet looking perfectly comfortable in such a state. If Anohana discounted the blatant worry and fear that had been prevalent on his features, not to mention the wide-eyed disbelief and sorrow, Ichigo had been in his arms, pale as death, and cold as one who possessed such an incurable illness. For a mild second, Retsu's heart had stopped in her chest at the still orange-haired Shinigami before her searching fingers had caught a pulse. Anohana had no time to ask questions or reassure Kion. She only directed one of her subordinates to contact the Shiba family, before Ichigo had been carted off into one of the vacant medical rooms, leaving a floundering Shiba and a pressure that hung around the fourth like a cloak. It had been a mad rush to figure out what plagued the kid. As Anohana remained calm, her trusted lieutenant at her side, she had scanned the youth. His Reisu had been near non-existent at the time, clinging close to him like a shell as if trying to protect him. Ichigo's skin had been cold and clammy, and she had been shocked to find his respiratory system beginning to fail, that accompanied by the worrying signs of hypothermia which led to a long night. In the end, his heart had stopped over 3 times throughout the night, and at one point the chance of survival depended entirely on Ichigo's own will to survive. She had jump-started the healing process within his body in the early morning, all the while maintaining a stable condition, because if he had fallen further, she doubted the rates of his survival would have been high even with sheer willpower. Sighing and sweeping her long hair neatly over her shoulders, Anohana took a breath and composed her thoughts, pushing aside the weariness that weighted her soul with the pressure of caring for such a troublesome patient. Sharp eyes followed the presences of her subordinates as they bustled about the fourth in an idle manner, till she landed on the mop of black hair she was looking for. Hanataro was perceptive, and it showed. As the Gentile Shinigami looked up, catching Anohana's presence and attention, he hurried over, traversing the long corridor with a nervous expression plastering his features as was normal. The seated Shinigami bowed slightly before his eyes took in the closed door with a hardness and determination Hanataro only mustered when it came to patience. The fourth, while generally comprised of weaker Shinigami strength-wise, always had those with wills of fire. It was how the profession seemed to work. With Hanataro's presence, the lashing whips of Reisu settled enough that Anohana, pulling her Reisu around her form, could enter the room. Her observant gaze took stock of the equipment lining the walls, and the general state of the room before landing on her patient. Additionally, she noted the sharp fading presence of Ichigo's Zanpakuto spirits. She had caught one of them, and she knew there was two, staring at Ichigo mournfully softly brushing orange strands before HA had faded away in the early morning sunlight. Hanataro scurried forward in a quick manner performing a first assessment while Anohana hung back to allow the young man to work. The seated Shinigami began by checking obvious signs and areas such as pulse, breathing, reflexes, as well as the equipment so that Retsu could assess the patient in a quick and efficient manner. He flashed her a hopeful smile and Retsu let a small reassuring and faintly proud curve of her lips show before she padded over to Ichigo's bed. He looked peaceful and so very young on the cot, the sheets drawn up to his chin as if just resting, but he also appeared stark against the overwhelming white of the fourth. It was a draining color, one that she had voted against when they designed the building, but this was Seoul society and when did they ever listen to sound advice? The color of his hair only added to the drastic contrast of light and dark, bringing out the paleness of his own skin, and reflecting the faint purple under his eyes that was steadily disappearing each day he spent in the healing coma, allowing his body to rest. Hanataro's Reisu peeked questioningly, and Anohana glanced over to see the young man standing beside one of the small circular windows. They had learned from Ichigo's last stay that wide windows would only encourage escape. She considered it for a moment, knowing that it was likely if they opened the windows there was a chance of disturbance or the interference of Ichigo's Reisu preventing them from reaching the window once more. On the other hand, the room needed the fresh air as did the patient, and she knew Ichigo was a fan of nature. He had spoken of the gardens he had visited, trees that towered over everything and were so wide and thick one could fit many people inside its trunk. He talked of meadows and flowers with a light airy voice that echoed someone he once knew. Nodding softly, Hanataro smiled in return and heft the windows open, letting a pleasant breeze curtail through the room and gently rustle their hair and clothing. It brought with it the mild smell of rain echoing the continuous rainfall of the past few days. Letting her hands hover over Ichigo's chest, she let the guiding hum of healing Kido flow about her as she assessed the patient, checking his vitals, circling the systems of his body, assessing the activity of his soul the best she could. He seemed to be almost completely recovered. Nothing a few days in bed rest wouldn't cure, though Kami knew getting Ichigo to stay in bed was a nigh impossible task. Though she doubted Ichigo would wake up any time soon if his previous state was any indication. The captain of the fourth, to make sure her patient received the exact care he needed, had done a full report, both on the incident and events that had led to the collapse. She had spoken to his friends and family in an attempt to nail down what had caused the drastic dip in health in the youth. What she heard didn't bode well. It stirred the old warrior inside her, and rustled softly with her spirit. Ichigo had only very recently started to confide in Anohana, as such they had only met up a few times. Often Ichigo sought her when he felt the need to chat. They would sit over tea and speak sometimes of nothing, the latest piece the lieutenant had found within in the archives, new discoveries in the field of medicine due to collaboration of the 4th and 12th divisions. Other times they would sit in silence and Ichigo would look as if he wanted to speak, but would hold his tongue, eyes promising. But then the incident with the wizard happened and she had hardly seen him, both during their training and in the following few weeks afterwards. She had understood the young man was busy, and that the training of a group of powerful Shinigami that had been hollowified was likely no small matter, and she was still waiting for Kisuke to pass the scientific notes correlating to health so she could treat them correctly if needed, but she had had no idea of what it truly was like. Anohana had always suspected that Ichigo suffered deeply from his time in the wars he had spoken of. She likened it to a condition of the mind or soul that affected him because of such traumatic events. She had seen its likeness many times over within her barracks, the many patients she treated who had suffered in some scaring way displaying similar mannerisms. While it varied for everyone, she recognized the flashbacks, the nightmares, and insomnia, the constant state of alert he maintained, along with his general reluctance to talk about such events, and the self-loathing he rarely displayed. It didn't help that it was likely he also suffered from melancholia according to what Kyan had suggested, a condition that was near unexplainable but affected many of the souls she had met nonetheless. It was a weight on the soul, something that pulled one down sometimes and almost stole the will to live. Recently though it seemed his symptoms had reached a new height, and he had finally crashed. Kyan likened it to a breakdown, stating that Ichigo had been spouting nonsense by the end, speaking of impossible things. They had all accounted the many nights they had seen one of the youngest Shibas upon the roof or wandering the garden, accounting for an increase in sleeplessness. Shinji had frowned when questioned before suggesting that the training, and transitions between Soul Society and their base, had likely stressed out the young man. The enigmatic blonde had also suggested the worry Ichigo had sustained both in maintaining the safety of the Vizard, and dealing with their return. Shunsui had spoken of the absent-mindedness Ichigo had displayed while at work, sometimes drifting to sleep at his desk only to jerk awake a few moments later. There had also been accounts of Ichigo flinching at nothing, which led Retsu to suspect he had been hallucinating. What his family had told her made the female captain want to slice both Ichigo and everyone else up, or at least intimidate them to the 7th layer of hell. For all honesty, she could give Ichigo a bit of slack. He obviously hadn't been in the right frame of mind, but that was still no excuse. His family should have aided him sooner once it was obvious his health was deteriorating. It didn't matter now, what happened was what happened. Now they needed to focus on Ichigo and healing. She suspected the coma was likely a form of healing his body and mind had submerged in, as once his Reisu had settled she could sense underneath the outlying hostility, warmth, and comfort. Satisfied with the skin and its results, Anohana stepped back, leaving room for Hanataro to complete the small matters that he was easily suited to and he had confided that he preferred doing. Hanataro said he found it relaxing and meditative, and Anohana faintly agreed. Her subordinate bustled around the room clearing out broken furniture, fixing the blankets, and when he was firmly settled within his rhythm he began speaking to Ichigo, or perhaps to himself. It's strange, because of what happened a captain's meeting was called and everyone was freaking out. But in the end, it's kind of secret that you're here, Shiba-san. After all, the public is far too proficient at spreading rumors. Well, in the end I think it will be fine. Hirako Teiko supposedly handled the situation, and was super creepy. Anohana muffled a small smile against the palm of her hand, as Hanataro continued to talk, just speaking in an uncomfortable manner that set one's nerves at ease. It was a peaceful thing to see, and she wondered if the medical theories Kisuke-san supplied were at all correct. The man suggested that speaking to coma patients was actually beneficial. The Rai captain hadn't exactly pinned down how, but he had suggested it was plausible, so she remained in the corner content to watch Hanataro putter about. Ichigo's Reisu had settled as time passed, drifting around the room lightly warm like a hearth. She studied the youth stretched on the mat once more, wondering what secrets Ichigo held so closely to his breast that they weighed him down so much that he suffered in such a way. Ichigo was a bright young man. Already he had greatly changed Soul Society and the rather ancient, though nothing compared to the Suteiko who seemed as if he had been here since creation. Captain could attest to that. Already change was seen within the hierarchy of Rungokai, and the power the Central 46 had was once more diminished to a respectable level. That wasn't to lose sight of the Vizard, a case that could have gone so horribly wrong. She knew the government she served, but in the end, had led to the strengthening of Soul Society as a whole. Retsu straightened fractionally as two familiar presences brushed across her senses. A faint smile curled on her lips as she swept from the room, Hanataro oblivious to her movements as he continued to ramble. The gentle curve of her lips and her soft countenance twisted away as the imposing persona of the fourth captain reinstated itself as she swept through the sterile barracks. Her own thoughts saddened, knowing that the two men she respected would likely be disappointed by her news. Yukatake looked well, though a bit pale, was her first assessment as she swept into the entry hall to the barracks. As always, her mind was focused on the rather sickly man. Dragging her eyes over to Kairo-raku, she noted the slight haggard and wild cast to his features. Having his lieutenant fall ill so disastrously after they had recently reunited must have been a hard blow for the normally easygoing man to take. The two were chatting under their breath, hands held between them tightly clasped, as if for support. Anohana paused in the doorway, waiting for the two men to compose themselves to face whatever news they sought. Jushiro coughed after a quiet moment disrupted only by their whispers gathering Retsu's attention, and she once more turned to face the two. Shunsui's eyes were set far off above her shoulder as if retreating from some great battle he was unwilling to face. "How's Ichigo?" Yukatake questioned softly, that fatherly concern he showed for any of his subordinates appearing in the tone of his voice, and the light of his eyes. Shunsui's eyes darted over lightning fast before he looked away again, as if both desperate and unwilling to hear the news. Anohana let out a soft sigh thinking of the young man, before she let a small reassuring smile curve her lips, and she replied, "He's doing better, his condition is stable, but I don't expect him to wake up for at least a few more days." Jushiro nodded, eyes a touch brighter to hear that the youth was relatively alright. Shunsui deflated slightly, all the tension bunched in his shoulders, leaving him with a small breath of relief. Staring at the two for a moment, brow furrowed in thought, Anohana recalled that Kyan hadn't appeared since he had brought Ichigo in a fortnight ago. Question on her lips, she returned her attention to the two men and asked, "How is Kyan?" "I haven't seen him here since that night. I would expect him to be waiting beside Ichigo's bedside regardless of my opinion." Jushiro frowned slightly at Anohana's question, the corners of his lips tilting downwards. The white-haired man sighed and looked to his partner. Shunsui flashed Jushiro one of his lopsided grins, the playful smile he always had for his partner. Amusement brightened Jushiro's features and the darkness dissipated as the sickly captain faintly smiled and replied, "I'm not surprised. Kukeku's been keeping him cooped up at the Shiba family home. The word is she's either too paranoid to let him go, thinking he will likely hurt himself, or some manner of danger will befall him. With the Shiba luck it's an inevitable thing. Or that he likely had a small cold from being out in the rain all night. Genja dropped by and assured me though, that Kyan will be free of his jail cell tomorrow. It must be hard on Kukeku, being the mature one of the three. Kyan can be plenty serious when the situation calls for it, but Kukeku keeps her head on her shoulders." Retsu processed the information with a slight smile, happy that Kyan was being taken care of at home where he was surrounded by family. On the other hand, she hoped the brat hadn't caught a cold from being in the rain. It would be rather silly considering his water-type Zanpakuto. She made a mental note to prepare the fourth for Kyan's visit tomorrow. She had no clue what it would bring, as the Shiba family were as a rule unpredictable. But she had no doubt of the man's energetic manner, and slightly overbearing personality when worried. Some claimed he was more of a mother hen than Anohana, to which Ichigo had sagely agreed in her confidence. "Can we see him?" Shunsui asked softly, a touch desperately, pulling the captain of the fourth from her musings. Anohana studied the man closely, understanding his concern and the guilt weighing his brow. Retsu pursed her lips for a moment in thought before she nodded and said, "I'm sorry, I'm not allowing visitors at the moment. His Reisu has been particularly volatile within the presence of most people in the division, and even when no one's around. I'm afraid an unknown or new presence could trigger it to regress into an even further aggressive state. I've already denied Hirako-san, and Urahara-san from visiting him today." She paused and considered the two for a moment, reflecting on their bond with Ichigo before she continued, "However, if you are willing you can try." Jushiro frowned slightly at the information, eyes dark in that protective way that she sometimes recognized in her own eyes when it came to her subordinates. Shunsui held a downcast expression, one that was grim but also a touch amused, as if knowing his lieutenant, he would expect nothing less. The two shared a glance, turning inwards to face each other, so that they could speak in hushed murmurs under their breath. Anohana let them, letting her attention drift to the rest of the division, keen eyes searching out any visible problems and idly assessing the patients laid out along the rows of cots. She frowned slightly as she noticed some trouble in the sector that the 11th Division had practically claimed as their own, and shook her head, noting it before moving on. Allowing her gaze to draw towards the two captains once more, she saw they had finished their discussion and seemed a great deal surer than they were when they first entered the fourth. Some of the life had returned to Jushiro, and Shunsui looked less like a tired old man and more of the usual flirtatious drunk. They were sharing a soft adoring smile with each other, and Anohana shook her head in amusement. The pair had been near inseparable since their first year in the academy, and while the many stints they had pulled were admirable to say the least, Yamamoto preferred to curse the brats. Their bond these days was deep as a well and one to be admired for all it had withstood. "It's fine, thank you for allowing us the chance to visit Ichigo, Retsu. But we'll wait till Kyan has seen Ichigo. He should see his brother first, and then we can affirm our own paranoia. Besides, our lunch break is almost over." Jushiro spoke with a gentle smile, eyes light and warm in that way he so often convicted. Shunsui turned with a half-cocked eyebrow before he interjected with his usual mirth, "What lunch break? I'm just dodging a paranoid and somewhat frantic Lisa." Jushiro chuckled quietly, well used to Shunsui's antics, and Retsu joined them under her breath, muffling the sound with a dainty palm. It reminded her of when they had been fresh out of the academy, the two following Yamamoto around like lost ducklings, all the while Shunsui cracking jokes, while Jushiro muffled his laughter under the disapproving glare of their mentor. Anohana nodded, a gracious smile on her face hiding some of the amusement that still shone in her eyes. She replied, "I'll alert you if anything changes." The two nodded and bowed before strolling out of the fourth, a light air about them as they chattered amicably. Retsu was glad to be able to settle their anxiety and fear. Kami knew that there would be many more concerned Shinigami in the next week, because Ichigo was magnetic like that. Maybe it was the charisma, the blunt honesty that was often shrouded by mysteries, and a good portion of it in her opinion was the naivete and overwhelming pain that convinced near everyone that the youth needed to be protected. Sighing once more, Anohana turned her gaze to the fourth, to the position she now managed, where once all that had mattered was the thrill of battle. Idly she reminded herself to pass Ichigo's room as she made her rounds, checking up on the many 11th Division members, and the Shinigami from the recent mission. Kyan paced because he was definitely not worried or anything of the sort. Nope, not at all. He could almost sense the amusement of the 4th Division members and others Shinigami waiting in the entrance hall. He couldn't really help it. Even Nejibana's normally relaxing Reisu had no affect, only soothing his nerves slightly enough that he wouldn't flip out and decided to destroy the demmed fourth. It wouldn't be such a problem if he hadn't been trapped within his own home for the past few days, only the bare minimum of news to confirm that Ichigo was alive and okay. Not to forget that his main source of entertainment had been paperwork, as Kukeiku had been stern on what activities he could attempt to complete. But Kukeiku had stated/enforced that he stay at home, as in her eyes he would only be in the way at the fourth. PSSHH, he was not like a dog when it came to an injured Ichigo, he wasn't. Nejibana's dismissive scoff trickled along their bond. And he was totally not sick. So what, he had sneezed a few times, and maybe his head was pounding, and he felt like he could sleep for 5 years. That was just the stress and worry. Nejibana's trickling laughter echoed throughout his mindscape, and Kyan deflated, acknowledging he was a little bit sick. But that was no excuse. He had wanted to be at Ichigo's bedside the first night when Anohana Teiko had carted him off, Reisu reassuring but the situation bleak. It was his duty as an older brother to stand guard at Ichigo's bedside should he wake, and if he had to wait he would comfort the torn soul with his presence and the lull of his Reisu. Kukeiku had appeared in a storm of worry and motherly concern, wrapping Kyan up in blankets that had appeared as if magically. He was still trying to process everything that had happened that night, and he had been in a state of shock, the cold seeping to his bones and flooding his mind, along with the bone-chilling imagery and haunting words. So, he had been dragged home where a worried Ganju had served piping hot tea, and a soup that was hearty and filled his chest with warmth, even as he sat there stock-still uncomprehending. He had moved like machine according to Kukeiku, and he couldn't much dispute that, as the whole night after the incident seemed like a blur, a haze of, oh my god, Ichigo's from the future, oh my god. He had spent the next 2 days trying to console his siblings, assure them that Ichigo would be fine, eventually, because Kyan was a big brother first and foremost and their health would overcome his sanity any day. Kyan would make sure that Ichigo would be alright in the end, because there was no way he was letting his little brother suffer alone anymore. A lot of the time he had sat out in the gardens under the light rain that soothed every frayed nerve and helped him to process the monumental news that had been dumped on him like the weight of the world. He meditated out there, uncaring of Kukeiku's chiding and nagging about sitting out in the damp air, clothes soaking wet, and perched on the same water-infused wood. He had run his younger brother's words through his mind, over and over again, trying to accept a fact that seemed so monumentally impossible. Yet even as he had reasoned that night, it made sense in a twisted kind of way. It left him with a multitude of haunting questions, because according to Ichigo, Kyan was dead in the future the youth came from, and that was slightly, very, disconcerting. Not to forget the wars Ichigo had spoken of even before he had revealed his time-traveler nature. Kyan wondered what enemies could appear that could challenge Soul Society so greatly. He knew of the Quincy, but they had been dormant for many years, and surely the Shinigami hadn't gotten so weak to be so easily defeated? Ichigo had also mentioned another time-traveler, and that left Kyan additionally wondering about the worn journal Ichigo sometimes carried around, the nights the orange-haired Shinigami spent running over calculations, or sneaking into the archives. It was funny how Ichigo thought Kyan didn't know about that. Was it all to figure out how he had crossed time and space? Or was it to identify the mysterious time traveler? It was all quite frankly a mess, and Kyan had only finished basically sorting it. But he understood enough to know that Ichigo had traveled through time and was now here, that he had changed the timelines already. He had saved the Vizard, and wasn't it a frightening thought to consider what would have happened if Ichigo hadn't been here, to consider how everything could be so very different, and as the time traveler of Hiaur had stated, convinced a certain megalomaniac away from attempted godhood. Kyan also had sworn both to himself and Nijibana that he would aid Ichigo in healing, support the youth in any way he needed, well okay, except for homicide, depending on the person. He was going to help Ichigo, save him, whether that be from himself or the enemies of the future that Ichigo couldn't defend against. If Ichigo needed a shoulder to talk to, then so Kami help him, that's what Kyan would be. If the kid needed a hug, then that was what Kyan would provide. Because damn it, he didn't want to see his baby brother like that ever again, so broken and hopeless. Ichigo needed to have that light in his eyes. Pulling himself together, Kyan plopped onto one of the low cushions neatly ordered around the entrance to the medical sector of the fourth. He sank into the chair like one would in water, and Kyan couldn't muster the energy to struggle his way out of the black hole-like cushion, as he waited for Anohana Teiko. He had caught Yuka Teiko and Kiriraku Teiko early on in the day when he had reported into work. They had delivered the message over tea that Ichigo was recovering. The news had taken some of the weight off of Kyan's shoulders, and it had been a relief to see his captain again. Even if it was only a few days, he always held a slight worry for the often sickly man. It had lightened his heart to see that the two were both fine, chatting amicably in their usual manner, because Kyan knew that the incident had to have hit Kiriraku Teiko hard. And whenever Kiriraku Teiko suffered, Yuka Teiko was right here beside him, so it was vice versa. They were partners, souls bonded for life. Sighing, Kyan let Nejibana's calming presence wash over him, rippling over the creaks and divots in his soul with a gentle touch, assuring him that everything would be fine. With a clack, the doors to the medical bay slid open with force, quiet and yet seemingly loud in the hospitalized atmosphere of strict silence. Craning his head to the side, Kyan spotted a crown of inky black hair and the gleam of Kensei-kan. Byakuya Kukaki paused to have finished with his rather dramatic entrance, and Kyan fixated his gaze on the Kukaki heir. He wondered why the youth was visiting now when he had the chance while Kyan was locked up at home. Byakuya turned assessing eyes around the room, scanning over the hospital beds and other waiting Shinigami, before they landed on Kyan, and deep ebony orbs lit up as the young lieutenant floated over, damn Kukaki and their infinite grace. Kyan resisted the urge to scowl, as while he respected Byakuya as Ichigo's friend and all the young noble had done for his brother, he would rather visit said brother alone, not to mention he was still sort of playing the blame game. Oh, Kyan had decided to take most of the fall, as the egocentric bastard he was. There were moments where it would rush over him, how useless and incompetent he had been in the situation. How that ignorance had led to his little brother lying in hospital bed stuck in a coma and so very deeply grieving for a lost world. But he also acknowledged with a slight bitterness that if Byakuya hadn't been busy eating dinner and on a date, or doing who knows what else, he may have been able to aid Ichigo before he completely snapped. But that was in the past. They all shouldered the blame, and he had no doubt Anohana would be reiterating that fact, so he smiled and welcomed the youth over with a gentle hand motion. Byakuya nodded relief, dispersing the tense weight that clung to his shoulders and frame upon closer inspection, and slipped over before lowering himself with the utmost grace into one of the cushions, where he promptly sank like a floundering fish. Kyan muffled laughter behind his palm as a humorous smile danced across Byakuya's lips. So, Kukaki brat, have you visited Ichigo yet? Kyan questioned teasingly with a light mirth his soul only faintly echoed. Byakuya turned, eyes widening fractionally in surprise before he composed himself and replied, "No, my grandfather was displeased with my actions, so I was unable to leave the compound except for work. He doesn't know I'm here." Byakuya's eyes were mischievous as he relayed the reason he was unable to visit sooner, and his own disobedience of his grandfather's orders. Kyan had to hand it to Ichigo, he sure knew how to corrupt someone, in the good way. If Byakuya had never met Ichigo, Kyan wondered what the youth would have been like. Probably the perfect example of a noble stick up their asses and all. Though the Shiba heir suspected that even underneath a noble facade, Byakuya would have retained his sense of humor. It was a sad thought, and Kyan was glad Ichigo was able to free Byakuya the early restraints of nobility, and even to loosen him from such a strain as an adult even slightly. "Ah, good old grandpa." Kyan responded with a nod and a wry grin. Byakuya's eyes radiated amusement even underneath the diamond-hard masks of nobility. Kyan could understand well the youth's disposition regarding his grandfather. The elder was on one hand exactly that, a senior who was a bit stuck in the times, but he was the man who had also raised Byakuya after his father had passed. The youth furrowed his brow in thought before asking, "What about you, Kyan-san?" Kyan smirked softly, mind skipping away from thoughts of gray-haired old men, and winked before he replied, "The wicked princess of the Shiba household got her claws on me, and I was unable to escape until today. She claimed that I was sick, which I vehemently deny." Byakuya cackled under his breath, sharing an empathetic gaze with Kyan before he composed himself once more. At that moment Kyan sneezed, rather quietly mind you, and received a rather pointed stare from Byakuya. Kyan shook his head in denial, eyes easily conveying a look of innocence and false disbelief to the amused noble. Byakuya nodded his head in complacent acceptance, while his features conveyed his sardonic refusal with an arched eyebrow and laughing eyes. Shaking his head balefully, Kyan listened to the quiet hum of Nijibana as a gentle silence fell between the two, and they waited for Anohana to return. It was a little while later, waiting rooms, and dim long waiting time, before the imposing female captain swept through the doorway, long ebony locks fanning out behind her like a curtain. Her predator eyes scanned the room before landing on the two Shinigami sunk within the cushions and unable to escape what was sure to eventually be a death blow. A smile slipped onto Anohana's lips, though it was nothing like the sadistically sweet one that promised only pain. It dissuaded Kyan's previous thoughts of pain only temporarily. This one was soft and gentle in the way Kyan thought only Anohana Teiko's hands could be. The woman wasn't one to entreat a patient to stay in bed with kind words and bribery. She used her force of will and the demonic aura that followed her around, echoing the unseen part of the female captain, the hidden warrior. Her hands, however, when dealing with a patient, were always gentle like a mother's touch. She was comforting them in a way she never normally was, and it was both strange and yet assuaging. Healing was a strange field. The people who devoted their lives to it were usually a brand of strange all their own, but they possessed a willpower that could rival a deity when it came to their patients. "You're both here to see Ichigo, I presume?" Anohana questioned, though in the end it was more of a statement if the raised brow and fey glittering eyes were any indication. Kyan nodded sharply, as beside him Byakuya stiffened his own cranium, mimicking a nod like a statue. If that was what Kyan had been like, he could understand Kukeku's concern over his well-being. The poised women's other brow arched, asking if they were coming, and Kyan held back a sigh as he considered the deep plum chair that was currently entreating him to a rousing argument about why he should never ever get up again. Byakuya bounced out of the seat, limber as a new sapling, and with all the energy Kyan felt he could muster once had sipped the god's nectar, otherwise known as caffeine in any form. A hand waved in front of his eyes, pulling him from muddling thoughts. Sitting down had not been a good idea for his mental state. Reflexively he swatted at the hand, but when it persistently remained an offering to aid, Kyan did sigh out loud and grasped Byakuya's outstretched hand. With a sharp tug Kyan was lifted to his feet and free of the dreadful, welcoming, temptation of sleep. Anohana was looking at the two of them in thinly veiled amusement, lips curved up in that saccharine way that was neither malignant but definitely not boding positively for the entry-eating party. With a sharp jaunt of thorny spring racer, the imposing captain swept into the medical bay. Sharing resolute looks of assurance, the two Shinigami slowly followed behind Anohana Teiko as she cut through the rather chaotic mass of people rushing to and fro, like one cut through butter, as they tended to the victims of the recent 11th Division duel. Kyan narrowly ducked and twisted around the scurrying bodies that passed, heedless of anything else, playfulness sparking in his soul as it reminded him of busy nights in the Shiba home when they had been young. The nobles had milled about as Kukeku, and Kyan scurried about under the coat-tails of Kimona's gleeful laughing. Byakuya cast Kyan an amused look from the corner of his eyes, while in front of them Anohana shook her head, presumably in amusement, as she muttered something about Shiba antics. Kyan only smirked, happy to provoke positive reactions from anyone in any situation, but most assuredly in situations where their souls needed a bit more light. As they drew closer to the secluded rear of the fourth where the individual rooms were kept, the air pressure became increasingly heavy. Kyan struggled for a moment, surprise striking and stealing any chance at defense before he composed himself and wrapped his rasu around himself like a blanket. Byakuya's breath hitched, and when Kyan looked over he could see a touch of nostalgia and familiarity on those carved features. If that hadn't answered the questions floating in Kyan's head, then the sharp burst of static rasu that could only ever belong to a certain orange head did. Anohana paused, then turning piercing eyes their way, she seemed to weigh her words for a moment, brow furrowed in thought before she cautioned, "It only gets worse as we venture closer." Ichigo's rasu had been very volatile since he was brought in. It has only settled for one of my subordinates, who as far as I know has had little to no interaction with Ichigo. The only reason I am allowing you two to visit, is because I know how close you two are with Ichigo. Kion frowned, and angling his body so he could better glimpse his partner in crime, he saw a mirroring expression on Byakuya's own features. It struck at the chords of hurt that still wound his soul, to hear that Ichigo's Reisu was so defensively lashing out. He worried what was chasing the youth now, that even in rest he was troubled. Or perhaps it was simply a protection his own body employed after far too many experiences, and wasn't there always far too many scars over Ichigo's body as it was, to suspect that some were not of battle cause. Anohana's countenance seemed to darken as she stared at the grim determination on their features undershadowed by the love they both felt for Ichigo, however different it was. Her mouth thinned and the corner of her lips turned down while she crossed her arms with a jolt. Kion had been expecting a talking to, so he only braced himself for the inevitable, the tearing open of a festering wound that was nowhere near healing, not till Ichigo had opened his eyes. Byakuya beside him jumped like a frightened hare, and Kion's eyes softened as he turned to face Byakuya. As much as Ichigo was mature, far too mature for his age, possessing the eyes of an immortal who had lived for centuries, Byakuya was very much still young and untested by the world. The guilt Kion felt roiling in his gut must have been like a sword to the chest for the Kukaki. Anohana's eyes softened imperceptibly as she considered the ebony-haired heir, before it disappeared and she reaffirmed her stance. Her voice was deceptively quiet when she spoke again. I acknowledge that you both already know what you have done wrong, and the guilt you feel is punishment enough. Even so, I need you to be informed of Ichigo's situation. As I have been told by you and others close to Ichigo, he suffers frequently from long-term flashbacks and insomnia, and recently he started experiencing hallucinations along with severe insomnia. You both need to realize that his state is very serious, and I think Ichigo suffers from one of the post-war conditions. He is a veteran of a war we haven't seen, and because of that we do not have the exact knowledge we need to aid him. Additionally, when correlating this with other symptoms and actions he has displayed, I believe he suffers from melancholia. She paused to let the words, like a hot iron through skin, sink in. Kion had always remotely acknowledged that his brother had problems. Even before he found out about the insomnia, there were times when Ichigo would space off and a broken, so very desolate expression would slip onto his features. But to think he suffered like that, while not totally unexpected, the conformation still hurt. There was accusation in her voice and it cut like a knife, because he should have realized sooner, should have done something to help with those conditions, they all should have. Why had they been so blind to one of their own's pain? Nijibana soothed him, a deep running sorrow thrumming their bond, even as determination pounded like a tsunami at his core. Byakuya choked on his breath softly, Reisu circling around him nastily. Shaking his head in concern, Kion rested a reassuring palm on the youth's shoulder, letting his own calming Reisu cloak the Shinigami's and echo peace like gurgling brooks. I am currently planning on ways to assist Ichigo, and you both need to realize how essential you are to his health. Ichigo is a man who thrives on family and the bonds he forms with them. You're the ones who are going to help him heal more so than I ever can. Anohana stated conviction in her voice. Her words stirred his soul, clearing the heavy air of grief and guilt, allowing him to focus. Byakuya took a deep breath, shoulders straightening and ebony eyes sharpened like obsidian under the crown of his hair. Anohana nodded to herself and led them further along the hallway. The air became increasingly heavy like wild winds. It ripped at their clothing, scratched at the walls, and tangled with their Reisu. Anohana foraged onwards, seemingly unaffected even as the force of her Reisu picked up till it pulsed around her skin in a soft blue hum. Casting a concerned glance at the youngest, and consequentially most inexperienced of the trio, Kion saw the youth was relatively alright. His eyes were glowing with suppressed Reisu, and the faint scent of cherry blossoms lingered in the air, but he continued to push forward as if he was walking over air. After a tense few minutes they reached the end of the hallway and consequently broached Ichigo's room. The rice paper frame shuddered and whipped about in a manner that was somewhat contained, but as they drew closer became frantic as if sensing danger. Anohana cast warning eyes behind her, cautioning them to wait as she hesitantly approached the doorway. The Reisu that had been previously frantic but was not exuding a malignant or dangerous feel, suddenly flipped menacing and dark. Kion only ever saw it with such qualities with Ichigo in the early morning mumbling under his breath, or early dawn after just waking from a dream that was far from pleasant. She sighed, cloaking her Reisu around herself so that she seemed almost to glimmer like a beacon, before beckoning them forwards. Hesitantly Kayan took a step forward, allowing the tidal wave of Nejabana's power to wrap around him and submerge the overbearing Reisu of his brother that reached out to entangle him. Byakuya frowned, eyes closing in concentration before the heavy scent of Sakura floated along the hallway and the youth stepped forward. It was as if they were preparing to enter a battlefield rather than entering the room of a patient. Anohana hesitantly rested her hand on the doorway. As the pressure increased and viciously the Reisu tore at them, as if trying to chase them away yet never injuring them, only whispering of danger. With a breath of courage, the female captain slid the door open. Immediately Ichigo's presence rushed at them as if freed from a great cage. It slammed into them, pushing their bodies against the wall, and noiseless screaming seemed to rush past their senses. Kayan frowned, breath leaving his lungs in heavy pants as his eyes strained to see the spot of orange against the stark bedding of the fourth. Anohana remained upright through sheer force of will, and likely experience with the powerful force before them. Turning worried eyes to the youth, Kayan frowned as he caught the sweat beading Byakuya's brow and the tight grasp he held on his Zanpakuto's hilt, seeking to draw strength from its material form. Extending his Reisu in front of the youth in a half-shield, Kayan smiled softly as the young man straightened fractionally, sending a grateful smile towards Kayan. A small frown replaced the smile, and Byakuya paused for a moment before, a touch sorrowful and guilty, he turned his eyes to Anohana and said, "I would like to try and stay to watch over Ichigo, even if that means standing out here for hours. But my grandfather is expecting me home soon, and I thought I would be able to visit quickly, but well, Ichigo is always damn stubborn. Just seeing him is a relief. I'll be back tomorrow though, that is if I can sneak away." Kayan nodded in understanding. While he wanted to tell the youth to fuck noble responsibilities, he also knew what it was like to feel the pressure from one's elders. And to feel disappointment when one was unable to succeed, especially from one's own grandfather. It also didn't help that he was being selfish and wanted Ichigo to himself. Anohana's lips curved up encouragingly, instead of disparagingly, which Kayan was eternally thankful for. The kid could feel guilty all he wanted about not being there for Ichigo, but it wasn't his damn fault that he was tied up with noble duties. "I can lead you to the exit. Kami knows it's usually a madhouse that few can navigate. Are you accompanying us, Shiba-san? I doubt you will see much more of your brother with the way his Reisu is reacting." Anohana asked, turning piercing eyes towards Kayan after speaking her piece to Byakuya. Kayan considered the keen women before him cynically before he saw the honesty of her question. She wasn't doubting his devotion to his brother, just honestly concerned about his ability to escape the fourth, in a positive way for once. Deflating slightly, Kayan turned a vacant gaze towards the room before replying, "I'll wait, I have the time. Even if I have to sit out in the hallway, I'll be here for my brother." Approval shone in Anohana Teiko's eyes as she nodded, a faint curve of her lips the only giveaway. Byakuya stared at Kayan, a touch of wonder and respect in that gaze before he bowed his head and said, "Please keep careful watch of Ichigo, Kayan-san." "Why the brat?" Kayan could see amusement and mischief radiating from the soul in front of him. Honestly, sometimes he did regret letting Ichigo ever get 2 feet near the Kukakier, though he suspected Jinrei-san regretted it most if not all of the time, because those two together always ended up in trouble. Okay, well, most of the time, oftentimes they were content to sip tea and chat about the latest gossip. Anohana nodded once to him, respect in her eyes before she was fleeing down the long, infinitely stretching hallways that all medical practices seemed to hold. Byakuya gave a small wave of prayer in his eyes, and Kayan hoped the kid would be okay before the youth was gliding after Anohana. Alone for once with Ichigo since the mess had started, Kayan turned his eyes towards the still open door and the patient inside. His own eyes were deep with a faint longing and the sorrow and empathy he emulated for his brother. As the two finally disappeared from sight, Ichigo's Reisu hovered around him, before it suddenly surged forward, sweeping around his form curiously as if asking who was in front of the room instead of defending. Kayan let his soul rise forth to meet the Reisu, the gentle calm waves, the crashing storms, the will to protect his family. The Reisu, still ever forceful, settled around him with a huff as if deciding that either he wasn't worth defending against, or he wasn't a threat, or maybe it recognized him. Kayan wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew when not to look a gift horse in the mouth. Letting Nejabana's soothing calm wash over him like a bomb, Kayan let go of the tension, the guilt, and everything negative pulling him down till it was just the warmth he held for life and all of its properties. His family, the ramen shop in the 13th sector of Rungokai, that one rug at the Shiba mansion that was always incredibly soft. Entering the room, Kyan's gaze zeroed on Ichigo, taking him in like a man in the desert would take to water. His steps were slow and measured in a strict sign of control, as he moved closer, Reisu poking at Ichigo's own, picking up on the faint undertones of warmth and comfort that hid under the blank unassuming wall of protection and emptiness. When he was beside the bed, Kyan truly let his eyes observe, tracing the thinness of Ichigo's features. He had always been so thin, and his unwillingness to eat had never helped, the light dusting of purple under his eyes a stark contrast to the abysses that had seemed to yawn beneath his eyes before that night. He looked peaceful, as if wherever his mind wandered it was a good place, and the thought contented Kyan softly. Peaceful and young, that was how Ichigo always looked in sleep, unless stolen away by terror-inducing nightmares. Raising a hand, Kyan hesitantly reached out and clasped Ichigo's own hand where it rested limply on top of the sheets. It was still cold, as if he couldn't shake the chill of that rainy night, but there was a trace of warmth, a pulse fluttering beneath searching fingers, and that was all Kyan needed. An assurance that he hadn't lost his brother because of his own ignorance, that the world hadn't lost such a bright soul of its own making. Without his consent, tears escaped his eyes and trailed down his cheeks in a dizzying reflection of his miasma of emotions. Maybe it was the relief he was alive, the pain of it all, and the horror of what Ichigo had faced. It could have been his own guilt catching up to him, or perhaps the mind-numbing hope that he would help Ichigo heal. Kyan stood there basking in Ichigo's presence with a soft smile for Kami knew how long. He could almost sense the physical manifestation of Ichigo's Zanpakuto, his blade kin, but it was faint and dim, still a reassurance that Ichigo wasn't alone. Nijibana crooned soft whispers in his ears, lulling him into a gentle state of rest and contentment where his thoughts idly drifted, and all there was a peaceful sort of nothingness. The hand he grasped tightly within his own twitched, and Kyan sharply glanced down, surprise lining his brow, into bleary amber orbs swathed in confusion and a strange mix of contentment, warmth, and nostalgia. Kyan internally freaked the flip out, because his brother was awake, and damn it, he had worried that his damn stupid younger brother would never wake up. The tears that had dried on his cheeks picked up once more, and Ichigo cracked a tired smile before in a rough voice he spoke. "Hey Kyan. Check the description for the links to the author."